Recorded Books and One-Click Digital present Why Kings Confess, a Sebastian Sincere Mystery, by C.S. Harris, narrated by Davina Porter and directed by Erica Jensen. This novel opens with a quote from Proverbs, chapter 28, verse 13. He that covereth his sins shall not prosper, but whoso confesseth and forsaketh them shall have mercy. And now, Why Kings Confess.
Chapter 1. St. Catherine's, East London, Thursday, 21st of January, 1813. Paul Gibson lurched down the dark, narrow lane, his face raw from the cold, his fingers numb. There were times when he wandered these alleyways lost in brightly hued reveries of opium-induced euphoria, but not tonight. Tonight, Gibson clenched his jaw and tried to focus on the tap-tap of his wooden leg on the icy cobbles, the reedy wail of a babe carried on the night wind, anything that might distract his mind from the restless, hungering need that drenched his thin frame with sweat and tormented him with ghosts of what could be. When he first noticed the woman, he thought her an apparition, a mirage of grey wool and velvet lying crumpled beside the entrance to a fetid passageway. But as he drew nearer, he saw pale flesh and the gleaming dark wetness of blood, and knew that she was only too real. He drew up sharply, the dank, briny air of the nearby Thames rasping in his throat. Cat's Hole, they called this narrow lane, a refuge for thieves, prostitutes, and all the desperate dispossessed of England and beyond. He could feel his heart pounding. The stars glittered like shards of broken glass in the thin slice of cold black sky visible between the looming rooftops above. He hesitated, perhaps longer than he should have. But he was a surgeon, his life dedicated to the care of others. He pushed himself forward again. She lay curled half on her side, one hand flung out, palm up, eyes closed. He hunkered down awkwardly beside her, fingertips searching for a pulse in her slim neck. Her face was delicately boned and framed by a riot of long, flame-red hair, her lashes dark and thick against the pale flesh of her smooth cheeks. Her lips purple-blue with cold. Or death. But at his touch, her eyelids fluttered open, her chest jerking on a sob, and a broken, whispered prayer. Sainte Marie, Mère de Dieu, priez pour nous pauvres pécheurs. It's all right. I'm here to help you, he said gently, wondering whether she could even understand him. Where are you hurt? The entire side of her head, he now saw, was matted with blood. Wide-eyed and frightened, she fixed her gaze on him. Then her focus shifted to where the black mouth of the passage yawned beside them. Damien! Her hand jerked up to clutch his sleeve. Is he all right? Gibson followed her gaze. The man's body was more difficult to discern, a dark, motionless mass deep in the shadows. Gibson shook his head. I don't know. Her grip on his arm twisted convulsively. Go to him, please. Nodding, Gibson surged upright, staggering slightly as his wooden peg took his weight and the phantom pains of a long-gone limb ripped through him. The passage reeked of rot and excrement and the familiar coppery stench of spilled blood. The man lay sprawled on his back beside a pile of broken hogsheads and crates. It was with difficulty that Gibson picked out the once snowy white folds of a cravat, the silken sheen of what had been a fine waistcoat, but was now a blood-soaked mess, horribly ripped. "Tell me," said the woman. "Tell me he lives." But Gibson could only stare at the body before him. The man's eyes were wide and sightless, his handsome young face pallid, his outflung arms stiffening in the cold. Someone had hacked open the corpse's chest with a ruthless savagery that spoke of rage tinged with madness. And where the heart should have been, gaped only an open cavity, bloody and empty. Chapter 2. Friday, 22nd of January. The dream began as it often did, with the sun shining golden warm, and the laughter of children at play floating on an orange blossom-scented breeze. Sebastian Sincere, Viscount Devlin, moved restlessly in his sleep, for he knew only too well what was to come. The thunder of galloping horses, a shouted order, the hiss of sabres drawn with deadly purpose from well-oiled scabbards. He gave a low moan. "Devlin?" Laughter turned to screams of terror, his vision filled with slashing hooves and bare steel stained dark with innocent blood. "Devlin!" He opened his eyes, his chest heaving as he sucked in a deep, ragged breath. He felt his wife's gentle fingertips touch his lips. Her face rose above him in the darkness, her features pale in the glow of the fire that still burned warm on the bedroom hearth. "It's a dream," she whispered, although he saw the worry that drew together her dark brows. "Just a dream?" For a moment he could only stare at her, lost in the past. Then he folded his arms around Hero and drew her close, so that she could no longer see his face. It was a dream, yes, but it was also a memory, one he had never shared with anyone. "Did I wake you?" he asked, his voice a hoarse rasp. "I'm sorry." She shook her head, her weight shifting as she sought in vain for a comfortable position, for she was nearly 9 months heavy with his child. "Your son keeps kicking me." Smiling, he placed his hand on the taut mound of her belly and felt a strong heel grind against his palm. Shockingly ill-mannered of her. "I think he's beginning to find it a wee bit crowded in there." "There is a solution." She laughed, a low, husky sound that caught without warning at his heart, then twisted. As much as he yearned to hold this child in his arms, thoughts of the looming birth inevitably brought a sense of disquiet that came perilously close to fear. He'd read once that more than 1 in 10 women died in childbirth. Hero's own mother had lost babe after babe, before nearly dying herself. Yet he heard no echo of his own terror in Hero's calm voice when she said, "Not long now." He felt the babe kick one last time, then settle, as Hero snuggled beside him. He brushed his lips against her temple and murmured, "Try to sleep." "You sleep," she said, still smiling. He watched her eyelids drift closed, her breathing slow. Yet the tension that thrummed within him remained, and he found himself wondering if it was the coming babe that had sent his unconscious thoughts drifting back to a time he wished so desperately to forget. A cold wind stirred the heavy velvet drapes at the windows and banged an unlatched shutter somewhere in the darkness. There were nights when the high, arid mountains and ancient stone-walled villages of Spain and Portugal seemed a lifetime away from the London townhouse sleeping around him. Yet he knew they were not. He was still awake when an urgent message arrived in Brook Street from Paul Gibson, asking for Sebastian's help. The woman lay in a narrow bed in the front chamber of Gibson's Tower Hill surgery. The room was small and plain, and lit only by a single candlestick and the enormous fire that roared on the hearth. Piles of blankets covered her thin frame, yet still she shivered. Between the blankets and the thick bandage that swathed the side of her head, Sebastian could see little of her face. But what he could see looked ominously pale and bloodless. "Will she live?" he asked quietly, pausing in the chamber's doorway. Gibson stood beside the bed, his gaze, like Sebastian's, on the unconscious woman before him. Difficult to say at this point. There could be bleeding in the brain. If so— He let his voice trail away. Sebastian shifted his gaze to his friend's gaunt face. He was looking unusually haggard, even for Gibson, his cheeks hollow and unshaven, his green eyes sunken and bloodshot, his wiry frame close to emaciated. He was only in his early 30s, yet streaks of grey already showed at the temples of his dark hair. The two men came from different worlds. One, the son of a poor Irish Catholic, the other, heir to the powerful Earl of Hendon. But they were old friends. Once they had both worn the king's colours, fighting from the mountains of Italy to the fever-racked swamps of the West Indies and the stony uplands of Iberia. As a regimental surgeon, Gibson had learned the secrets of life and death with an intimate familiarity rarely matched by his civilian peers. When a French cannonball tore off the lower part of one of his legs and left him bedevilled by chronic pain, he had come here, to London, to share his knowledge of anatomy at the teaching hospitals of St. Thomas's and St. Bartholomew's, and to open this small surgery in the shadow of the Tower of London. "And if there is bleeding in the brain?" Sebastian asked. "Then she'll die." "How can you know?" "Only time will tell. And then there's the risk of pneumonia." Gibson shook his head. "Her body temperature was dangerously low when I found her. I've packed flannel-wrapped hot bricks around her, but there's not much else I can do at this point." "What was she able to tell you about the attack?" "Nothing, I'm afraid. She lost consciousness when she learned of her companion's death, and she's yet to come round again. I don't even know her name." Sebastian glanced at the blood-stained grey-wool walking dress and velvet-trimmed spencer tossed over a nearby chair-back. Both were worn, but other than for the new stains, were clean and respectable. This was no common woman of the streets. "And the dead man, what do you know of him?" "He's a French physician named Dr. Damien Pelletan." "A Frenchman?" Gibson nodded. "According to his papers, he registered as an alien just 3 weeks ago." He raked his dishevelled hair back from his face with splayed fingers. "The fools who pass for the authorities in St. Catherine's are convinced the attack was the work of footpads." "St. Catherine's is a dangerous place," said Sebastian, "especially at night. What the devil were you doing there?" Gibson's gaze drifted away. I sometimes feel the need to walk of an evening." Sebastian studied his friend's flushed, half-averted face and wondered what the hell would drive a one-legged Irish surgeon to wander the back alleys of St. Catherine's on one of the coldest nights of the year. "You're lucky you didn't fall victim to these footpads yourself." Footpads had nothing to do with this. Sebastian raised one eyebrow. "So certain?" Gibson nodded to the middle-aged matron who dozed in a slat-backed wooden chair beside the fire. "Keep an eye on the woman," he told her. "I won't be long." To Sebastian, he said, "There's something I want you to see." Chapter 3. At the base of the frost-browned, unkempt yard that stretched to the rear of the surgery stood a low stone outbuilding where Gibson conducted both his official post-mortems and the surreptitious illegal dissections he performed on cadavers filched from the city's churchyards by body-snatchers. Of one room only, with high windows to discourage the curious, the building had a flagged floor and was bitterly cold. At its centre stood a granite slab with strategically placed drains and a channel cut into the outer edge. The body of a man, still fully clothed, lay upon it. "I haven't had a chance to begin with him yet," said Gibson, hooking the lantern he carried onto the chain that dangled over the slab. It sometimes seemed to Sebastian as if every suicide, every bloated body pulled from the Thames, every decaying cadaver that passed through this building had left a stench that seeped into its walls, their muted howls of anguish and despair echoing still. He took a deep breath and entered the room. If St. Catherine's authorities are convinced he was killed by common thieves, I'm surprised they agreed to an autopsy. They weren't exactly what you might call enthusiastic. To quote Constable O'Keefe, Gibson puffed out his cheeks, narrowed his eyes, and adopted a decidedly nasal accent. "What you want to be bothering with all that for, then? Sure, but any fool can see what killed him." The lantern swung back and forth on its chain, casting macabre shadows across the slab and its grisly occupant. He put up a hand to still it. "I had to promise I wouldn't be charging the parish for my services. And I paid the lads who carried the body here, myself." Sebastian studied the slim, slightly built man upon the surgeon's slab. He was young yet, probably no more than 26 or 28, with a pleasant, even-featured face and high forehead framed by soft golden curls. His clothes were of a good quality, better than the woman's, and considerably newer, fashionably cut in the Parisian style and showing little wear. But what had once been a fine silk waistcoat and linen shirt were now ripped and soaked with blood, the chest beneath hacked open to reveal a gaping cavity. "What the hell? He looks like he was attacked with an axe." "It's worse than that," said Gibson, tucking his hands up under his armpits for warmth. "His heart has been removed." Sebastian raised his gaze to the Irishman's solemn face. "Please tell me he was already dead when this was done to him." "I honestly don't know yet." Sebastian forced himself to look again at that ravaged torso. "Any chance this could be the work of a student of medicine?" "Are you serious?" "Even a butcher would have been more delicate. Whoever did this made a right royal mess of it." Sebastian shifted his gaze to the dead man's face. His eyes were large and widely spaced, the nose prominent, the mouth full-lipped and soft, almost feminine. Even in death there was a gentleness and kindness to his features that made what had been done to him seem somehow that much more horrible. "You say he was a physician?" Gibson nodded. "He was staying at the Gifford Arms in York Street. The constables brought round a gentleman from the hotel, Monsieur Vendreuil, to identify him. Yet he couldn't identify the woman. Said he'd never seen her before. He also said he'd no notion what Pelletan might have been doing in St. Catherine's." Gibson rubbed the back of his neck. "I should mention that along with his papers, the constables also found a purse containing both banknotes and silver. Yet they're convinced he fell victim to footpads. The theory is that the thieves were interrupted." "By you? I certainly didn't see anyone. But then—" "But then what?" asked Sebastian. Gibson coloured. "I was rather lost in my own thoughts." Sebastian watched his friend look pointedly away, but remained silent. Gibson said, "If he were English, the circumstances might be strange enough to prod even St. Catherine's authorities into taking action. But he's not. He's a Frenchman, a stranger, which makes it all too easy to simply dismiss the murder as the work of footpads and forget it." Sebastian lowered his gaze to the pallid corpse on the slab between them. For some reason he couldn't have named, he knew a faint, unsettling echo of that night's troubled dream, and all the unwanted memories it had provoked. For 2 years now he had dedicated himself to achieving a measure of justice for murder victims who would otherwise be forgotten. And it occurred to him, not for the first time, that those faraway events in Portugal had more to do with his preoccupation than he cared to explore. He said, Where exactly in Cat's Hole were they? There's a small passage that opens up between a cooperage and a chandler's shop on the river side of the lane. I suspect he was attacked in the street and then dragged back into the passage before this was done to him. And the woman was lying in the lane, just before the passage. Sebastian nodded and turned toward the door. I'd best have a look around the area now, before the neighbourhood begins stirring. No! It's the middle of the bloody night. Sebastian paused to look back at him. You think it unwise of me to go wandering about St. Catherine's alone in the dark, do you? Gibson grunted and reached to unhook the lantern. Here, at least take this. Thanks, but I don't really need it. Gibson gave a rueful laugh, his fist tightening around the lantern's handle. Sebastian was as famous for his ability to see in the dark as for his keen hearing and sharp eyesight. No, I don't suppose you do. But, Devlin, be careful. Whatever this is, it's ugly. Very ugly. The ancient district known as St. Catherine's ran along the northern bank of the Thames, just to the east of the ancient Tower of London. A warren of crooked lanes, crowded tenements, and dark courts, it was named for the hospital of St. Catherine's that lay at its centre. Although called a hospital, St. Catherine's was not so much a medical institution as a benevolent establishment dedicated to the care of the poor. As one of London's medieval liberties, the area surrounding the old monastic buildings had long been a haven for foreign craftsmen seeking the protection it offered from the city's powerful guilds. But along with the Flemish coopers, French artisans, and German brewers, who flocked to the area, had come thieves and whores, beggars and vagabonds. It was not an area a wise man wandered after dark, and Sebastian found himself wondering again what the hell Paul Gibson had been doing here, alone, on such a cold winter's night. Or what Damien Pelletan and his unidentified female companion had been doing here. Sebastian walked up the dark, narrow lane with one hand on the double-barreled pistol in his pocket, his footsteps echoing hollowly in the icy silence, his senses alert for the slightest hint of movement or whisper of sound. The wind had died, and with the approach of false dawn, a mist was beginning to creep up from the water's edge, thick and stealthy. In another hour, these streets would begin to fill with costermongers, apprentices, and dustmen. But for the moment, all was still. He found the passage readily enough, just beyond the battered, shuttered facade of a cooperage. Like virtually all the lanes in St. Catherine's, Cat's Hole was too narrow for footpaths. The dilapidated, closely packed tenements and tumble-down shops rose directly from the worn, ice-glazed cobbles of the roadway itself. It took Sebastian only a moment to find the smear of blood near the corner of the passage. The woman's blood, he wondered, or Pelletan's? Squatting beside the bloodstain, he studied the surrounding jumble of muddy footprints and crushed ice. But between Gibson, the constables, and the men who'd helped carry Pelletan and his injured companion to Gibson's surgery, any traces left by the murderer had been hopelessly trampled over and destroyed. The sound of a soft snort brought up his head, and he found himself staring into the soft brown eyes of a half-grown pig that had been rooting through a nearby pile of garbage. "So," said Sebastian, "did you see anything?" The pig snorted again and trotted away. Sebastian rose thoughtfully to his feet, his eyes narrowing against the thickening fog as he turned to consider the deserted lane. From here he could see the massive soot-stained walls of the tower rising at the far western end of the lane. Which direction had Pelletan and the unknown woman been travelling, he wondered? Towards the relatively open ground surrounding the old medieval fortress? Or had they been headed east, deep into St. Catherine's warren of dark, dangerous alleys and courtyards? He turned his attention to the foul passageway beside him. Unlike the lane, the passage had never been paved. Beneath the soles of his Hessians, the thick, ice-crusted muck reeked of offal and manure and rotting fish heads. Yet, despite the trampling of so many feet, Sebastian was able to find the impression left by the dead man's body in the lee of a pile of broken crates and hogsheads. He hunkered down, his gaze carefully assessing the surrounding area. He noted the blood-splattered wood of a nearby crate, the piece of torn, blood-stained linen trampled into the mud, more footprints hopelessly muddled. Then he widened his search, looking for something, anything, that might give a hint as to who had killed Damien Pelletan. He was also looking for the dead man's heart. He did not find it. Frustrated, he brought his gaze back to that blood-splattered pile of broken crates. What kind of a murderer hacks open his victim and steals his heart? Sebastian wondered. A madman? It was the obvious answer. Yet Sebastian had known British soldiers, even officers, who laughingly collected from their fallen enemies mementos ranging from severed fingers to ears. It was, after all, the British and French who had taught the American natives to collect scalps. Was that what they were dealing with here? Some half-mad collector of war trophies? He supposed it was always possible. But a heart? Why would a murderer steal his victim's heart? The heart was a potent symbol of so many things, of love, of courage, of life itself. Was the theft of Damien Pelletan's heart symbolic? Or was it something else, something darker, something more evil? And he knew it again, that whisper of memory, elusive and troubling. He pushed quickly to his feet. He was turning to leave when he saw it. The clear imprint of a shoe left on a broken slat of wood half trampled into the mud. It wasn't an entire footprint, only the heel and part of the sole. But there was no mistaking that mingling of mud and blood. The shoe's wearer had obviously trodden here after Damien Pelletan's death. Reaching down, Sebastian freed the piece of wood from the muck, careful not to disturb the telltale outline of mud and blood it bore. He stared at the imprint thoughtfully. It was always possible that the shoe's owner had come through the passage in the last several hours and had nothing to do with the murder. So Sebastian began again to study the confusion of footprints in the garbage-strewn muck. It took some time, but he finally found a place where a similar shoe print had been clearly pierced by the imprint of a peg leg. Whoever left these footprints had been in the passage after Pelletan's death, but before Gibson. Sebastian shifted his gaze again to the slat of wood in his hands. The shoe print wasn't much to go on, certainly not enough to identify the killer, but it forced Sebastian to reassess completely every assumption he'd made about that night's events, for there was no mistaking the curve of that arch or the fashionable shape of the small, narrowed heel. It was the print of a woman's shoe. Chapter 4. When Hero Devlin was 12 years old, she came to 3 life-altering conclusions. There were just as many stupid men as stupid women in the world, if not more. She would never, ever hide her own intelligence or knowledge in a craven attempt to conform to her society's expectations and prejudices. And as long as England's laws gave a husband virtually the same powers over his wife as those exercised by slave owners over slaves, Hero herself would never marry. She had announced these convictions one evening at dinner. Her father, Charles, Lord Jarvis, simply continued eating as if she'd never spoken, while his mother snorted in derision. But Hero's own mother, the gentle, slightly addle-brained Annabel, Lady Jarvis, had whispered softly, "Oh, Hero." Over the next several years, Hero's critical assessment of society had continued unabated. She read Mary Wollstonecraft and the Marquis de Condorcet. She refused to allow her revulsion at the excesses of the French Revolution to diminish her admiration for its fundamental principles. And she began to write, using her research skills and reasoning abilities to work to change the numerous injustices she observed around her daily. Now, in her mid-20s, Hero's radical opinions remained intact, but her determination never to marry had fallen victim to a certain dark-haired, golden-eyed viscount with a mysterious past and a powerful passion of his own. She felt the baby kick again, hard enough this time to take her breath, and she set aside the new article she was writing on London's working poor to go stand at the drawing-room window overlooking the street below. A thin white mist drifted between the tall houses, dulling the rising sun to a glowing red ball and muffling the sounds of the waking city. It was just the kind of morning for a good gallop. Unfortunately, one did not gallop in Hyde Park, especially when one was 9 months heavy with child. She fought down an uncharacteristic upwelling of impatience and frustration. She had borne most of her pregnancy with ease, continuing her normal activities here and in the country, and sallying forth frequently to conduct interviews for her series of articles. But over the past few days, the baby seemed to have settled. Even sitting was becoming difficult, sleep nearly impossible, and she found herself filled with a restlessness that was becoming increasingly difficult to stifle. She was about to turn back to her article when she heard the front door open and Devlin's quick tread on the stairs. He drew up in the entrance to the drawing-room to swing off his greatcoat and set aside the broken slat of wood he carried. "I was hoping you'd lie in this morning," he said, coming to catch her to him and give her a long, lingering kiss that made her breath quicken, even now, big with his child. "You aren't sleeping much these days." He smelled of wood smoke and frosty air and all the invigorating scents of early morning, and before she could stop herself, she said, "What I'd really like to do is go for a walk, a real walk, in the park." He laughed, his hands tightening on hers. "Then let's go." She shook her head. "Dr. Croft warns me that I may take a brief turn around the garden, once in the morning and again in the evening, but no more." Richard Croft was London's most respected accoucheur, a pompous and self-important little man, utterly convinced of the efficacy of what he called his lowering system for the treatment of ladies facing confinement. He had tutted in horror when Hero and Devlin finally returned to London after spending 3 months at Devlin's estate down in Hampshire, going for long walks in the bracing rural air and enjoying the countryside's abundant fresh foods. In Croft's professional opinion, anything more than a severely restricted diet and ladylike restrained exercise could be disastrous for the safe outcome of a confinement. "Is that before or after you have the bowl of thin gruel he allows you?" asked Devlin. "Oh, definitely before. To exercise after taking sustenance can be fatal, you know. If you call walking in the garden exercise, and thin bouillon sustenance." He laughed again, his smile fading slowly as his gaze searched her face. "How are you feeling, truly?" "Truly? I'm hungry, uncomfortable, and beyond cranky. But never mind that. I want to hear about Gibson." Another man might have sought to spare his pregnant wife the more macabre aspects of Damien Pelleton's murder. Devlin knew better. As she listened to him describe his search of Cat's Hole and the passageway where the body was found, she went to pick up the broken slat. "A woman's shoe? Are you certain?" "Have you ever seen a man's shoe with that kind of heel?" She stared down at the clear imprint of mingled mud and blood, No, you're right. This was definitely left by a woman's shoe. She looked up at him. How difficult is it to remove a heart, anyway? I honestly don't know. I'll need to ask Gibson. The clang of a milkmaid's pails drew Hero's gaze again to the street. The fog was beginning to burn off, the white sky filling with seagulls wheeling above the rooftops, their haunting cries beckoning her like a siren's call. The urge welled within her again to feel the cold mist on her face and let the wind catch at her hair and be done with this interminable waiting. As if aware of the drift of her thoughts, Devlin said, "How about if I order the carriage and take my wife for an illicit early morning walk in the park? We won't tell Dr. Croft, and between the fog and your heaviest police, not even London's nosiest busybodies will be able to tell that my bride of 6 months is only weeks away from delivering my daughter." She smiled. "Your son. I keep telling you it's a boy." Then she shook her head. "No, you need to visit the Gifford Arms Hotel and see what they can tell you about this Frenchman." He came to bracket her cheeks with his palms and kiss her on the mouth. A long, slow kiss that reminded her they hadn't made love since the previous October, when the esteemed Dr. Richard Croft had sternly warned her that she must carefully avoid any animalistic appetites. He said, "The Gifford Arms will wait an hour." A small but eminently respectable hotel, built of neatly squared sandstone blocks, the Gifford Arms lay on the south side of St. James's Park, not far from the intersection of James and York Streets. Dating to late in the previous century, it had tidy rows of sashed windows flanking a central door that led to a short flagged stairwell. As was typical of inns of that period, the coffee room opened off the passage to the right, with a dining parlour to the left. Closing the door against the damp cold, Sebastian breathed in the warm, welcoming sense of roasting lamb and beeswax and hearty ale. But both the entrance passage and the rooms opening off it were deserted. "Hello?" he called. Silence. Stepping into the oak-panelled coffee room, he turned a slow circle, his gaze drifting over the scattering of empty tables and chairs. "Hello?" He heard a quick step, and a droopy-jowled, lanky man in a leather apron appeared in a far doorway. "May I help you, sir?" He had straight fair hair, just beginning to turn grey, and protuberant, widely set eyes that gave him somewhat the look of a startled mackerel. "I'm here about Dr. Damien Pelleton," said Sebastian, choosing his words carefully. The man's face puckered. "Oh dear. Are you a friend of Dr. Pelleton's, sir?" "Not exactly." "Ah, well, the thing is, you see, we've had the constables here. They're saying Dr. Pelleton's dead." The man edged closer and dropped his voice to a confidential whisper. "Murdered. In St. Catherine's. Just last night. Footpads." "How long had Dr. Pelleton been staying here?" "About 3 weeks, I'd say. Same as the rest of them." "The rest of them?" prompted Sebastian. "Aye. They rented the entire inn, you know. They're the only ones staying here now." "No, I didn't know." "Frenchman." He said the word as if it were enough to explain any eccentricity. "They even brought in their own cook and servants, they did. I'm the only regular left." "Are all their servants French as well?" "Oh, aye, the lot of them. Émigrés, I assume." The man tweaked the top of one ear and screwed up his face. "Well, they say they are." "But you doubt them?" The man gave a quick look around and leaned closer still. "Seems a queer thing to do, don't it?" he asked, his voice sinking even lower. "To take over a whole hotel like this. I mean, why not hire a house, like proper Englishmen? Perhaps they don't intend to be in London long. Or perhaps they're looking to purchase something. I ain't seen no sign of it. If you ask me, he's more than queer. I mean, why go to such pains to stay someplace altogether? It ain't as if they like each other, that's for certain. Do they quarrel? All the time. Leastways, it sure looks and sounds like they're quarrelling. Not that I can understand what they're saying, mind you, seeing as how I don't speak the French and all. Families frequently do quarrel, observed Sebastian. Aye, but this lot ain't family. Leastways, not most of them. Oh? Who is here besides Dr. Pelletan? Well, let's see. There's Armand Vondroy. He's the one in charge. Although I get the feeling that don't sit too well with the Colonel. The Colonel? Aye. Colonel Fouché, he calls himself. Don't know the rest of his moniker. Then there's Vondroy's clerk. Bonderon is his name. A skinny rabbit of a man he is. Spends all his time with his nose stuck in some book. So only 4, including Pelletan. 5, if you count the girl. The girl? Vondroy's daughter. Ah. And they hired the entire hotel? Like I said, they're a queer bunch. His mouth hung open, allowing his jowls to sag even further. And up to no good, I'd say. Or my name's not Mick Peebles. A heavy thump sounded overhead. Sebastian said, When did you last see Dr. Pelletan? Mick looked thoughtful. I suppose that would have been last night, when them two came looking for him. Them two? A man and a woman. Didn't give their names. What time was this? About 9, maybe? What did the woman look like? Couldn't rightly say. She wore a veil, you see. And the man? Afraid I didn't pay him much mind. Stayed in the background, he did. Don't recollect even hearing him speak. They met with Pelletan in the dining room? Oh, no, sir. The doctor went outside and talked to them, like he didn't want none of the others to see them. And how long after that did Pelletan leave? Oh, not long. He come back in and went up to his room for his greatcoat, then he left. Walking? I don't know, didn't notice. Mick frowned. Why are you asking all these questions anyway? I'm interested. Tell me this. Was the woman English or French? Oh, she was a Frenchie, although I'll admit her English was considerably better than most of 'em's. How was she dressed? Mick shrugged. Respectable like, I suppose you could say, but not in the first stare of fashion, if you know what I mean. How old would you say she was? Gave another twitch of the shoulder. Not old, but not real young, neither. With that veil, I couldn't tell you much else. The description fit the unknown woman in Gibson's surgery, but it would also fit 1,000 or more French women in London. Sebastian said, Tell me this. What manner of man was Dr. Pelletan? Would you describe him as pleasant or quick-tempered? Pelletan? Mick paused to scratch the side of his face. He weren't half bad, for a Frenchman. There's no denying he was the nicest of the lot, him and Miss Madeline. Miss Madeline? Vondroy's daughter. And how old is she? About 25, I'd say. Maybe a bit less. Sebastian, who had been picturing a child in pigtails, was forced to readjust his mental image. Have you seen Miss Madeline this morning? Oh, aye. Mitt's eyes narrowed with a sudden renewal of his earlier suspicion. Why'd you say you was asking all these questions? Just curious, said Sebastian. Mick Peebles fixed him with a long, hard stare. You're a right curious fellow, ain't you? I am, yes. Can you think of any— He broke off at the sound of heavy footsteps coming down the stairs and a man's deep voice saying, À quelle heure? Sebastian could see them now. 2 men, one middle-aged and stout, The other, taller, younger, and considerably leaner, with a swooping, sandy-haired moustache and unmistakable carriage of a military man. They crossed the short entry passage and left the inn without glancing toward the coffee-room. Sebastian nodded after them. "I take it that was Monsieur Vaudreuil and Colonel Fouché?" "It was, yes." Sebastian watched the old-fashioned wavy glass in the multi-paned front windows as the two men hailed a hackney. The tall, rather gaunt man with the military bearing was unknown to him, but he recognized Armand Vaudreuil immediately. He had seen the Frenchman just the week before, briefly, in Pall Mall, riding in a carriage with the King's powerful cousin, Charles, Lord Jarvis. Ruthless, cunning, and utterly devoted to both the monarchy and Britain, Lord Jarvis controlled a personal network of spies and informers that made him virtually omnipotent. He was also Sebastian's new father-in-law, and a dangerous, deadly enemy. Chapter 5. Paul Gibson sat in a wooden chair drawn up to the unknown woman's bedside, his gaze on her face. She was so pale, her closed eyelids fragile and nearly translucent, the skin drawn tight over the exquisitely moulded bones of her face. And if she didn't awaken soon, she probably never would. He pushed to his feet and went to stare out the narrow window overlooking the ancient medieval street beyond. The sun was high enough to begin burning off the fog, but there was little warmth in it. Rows of icicles glistened from the eaves, and he could feel the bitter cold radiating off the glass. Turning, he went to stoop beside the hearth and throw more coal on the fire. He was about to straighten when he became aware of the sensation of being watched. Glancing over at the bed, he found himself staring into a pair of dark brown eyes. "Good morning," he said, lurching awkwardly as he straightened. Her tongue flicked out to wet her dry lips, her chest jerking as if with fear. He said, "You needn't worry. I'm a friend." "I remember you." Her voice was a hoarse whisper, her English accented but distinct. "You are the one who—" Her eyes darkened as if with a resurgence of remembered grief. "Is Damien truly dead?" "Yes. I'm sorry." She blinked rapidly several times and turned her face away, her glorious flame-colored hair fanning out over the pillow. "He was your friend?" Gibson asked quietly. Rather than answer, she put her hand to her head, the long, fine fingers exploring the bandage she found there. "What happened to me?" "You don't remember?" "No." He walked up to the side of the bed again. "It may eventually come back to you. Memory is a funny thing." She looked at him again. "Where am I?" "This is my surgery." "You are a surgeon?" "I am." He sketched an awkward bow. "Paul Gibson, late of His Majesty's 25th Light Dragoons." She let her gaze drift over him, making him wish he'd taken the time to wash and shave and maybe change his clothes. She said, "You lost your leg fighting the French?" "I did, yes." "I am French." He smiled. "I had noticed." To his surprise, the flesh beside her eyes crinkled with amusement. Then the smile, faint as it was, faded. Her gaze drifted about the room as if searching for something or someone. "I remember hearing another man's voice. Someone talking to you." "The constable's, perhaps?" "No. This was an educated voice." "Ah, that would have been Lord Devlin." "Devlin? He's a friend of mine." She was silent for a moment, lost in her own dark thoughts. Then she said, "You did not tell me what is wrong with my head." "I suspect you were either hit or you struck the side of your head when you fell. How badly am I injured? I don't think the skull is fractured, but I'm worried about concussion. Are my pupils dilated? No. The question revealed a depth of medical understanding he wouldn't have expected. Was your father a doctor? Something flared in her eyes, only to be quickly hidden by the downward sweep of her lashes. It is, yes. In Paris. Is there someone I should let know you're safe? He decided the personal pronoun sounded too familiar and changed it. We don't even know your name. Again she studied his face as if assessing him. My name is Alexandre Sauvage. I live alone with only a servant, but Carmela is a good woman, and is doubtless concerned about what has become of me. I'll see she knows you're safe. She gave him directions to her rooms in Golden Square. Then she fell silent, her eyes drifting half-closed. But she was still alert, tense even. And Gibson suspected her thoughts had returned to the man whose corpse lay in the outbuilding at the base of the yard. Gibson said, Do you remember why you were in Cat's Hole last night? Her gaze refocused on his face. Yes, of course. Damien had agreed to go with me to see the child. Child? What child? There is a French woman, Madame Claire Bisset, who lives in Hangman's Court. Her little girl, Cécile, is gravely ill. And did Pelletan see her? He did, yes. But he was as baffled by her condition as I. I fear she is dying. Her head moved restlessly against the pillow. I promised I would be back this morning to see her. Gibson put his hand on her shoulder, stilling her. Don't distress yourself. I'll visit her, if you'd like. Beneath his hand, her flesh was soft and warm. She stared up at him. She has no money to pay you. He shook his head. It doesn't matter. Just tell me. He broke off, his gaze meeting hers, her eyes wide with a new leap of fear as loud voices sounded in the street outside, and a heavy fist pounded on the front door. Chapter 6. In addition to extensive estates in the country, Charles, Lord Jarvis, owned a large townhouse on Berkeley Square that he shared with his invalid wife and his aged mother. Since his contempt for the former was matched only by his profound dislike of the latter, he spent as little time at home as possible. When in London, he could generally be found either at his clubs or in the chambers reserved for his use here at Carlton House by the Prince Regent. For 30 years he had served the House of Hanover, dedicating his prodigious intellect and unerring talents to the preservation and exaltation of his country and its monarchy. Acknowledged by all as the real power behind the prince's fragile regency, he had steered Britain safely through decades of war and the perils of social unrest that could all too easily have consumed her. Now he stood at the window overlooking Pall Mall, his attention seemingly divided between the forecourt below and the slight freckle-faced Scotsman who lounged with his back to the fire, the tails of his exquisitely tailored coat lifted up and to the sides so as to better warm his backside. Angus Kilmartin had a small bony face with oversized features and a halo of frizzy, coppered-coloured hair that combined to give him an almost comical appearance. But in the Scotsman's case, appearances were definitely deceptive. Kilmartin was shrewd and venal and utterly amoral. By heavily investing in well-selected war-related manufactories, he had risen in the space of 20 years to become one of the wealthiest men in Britain. "The question is," said Kilmartin, "does his death mean anything?" Jarvis reached for his snuff-box and flicked open the box's filigree and enamel lid with one agile fingertip. It undoubtedly means something to someone. Whether it should concern us or not, however, remains to be seen. Does it?" The silence in the room was suddenly dangerously strained. "Are you questioning my analysis, or my veracity?" asked Jarvis with deceptive calm. A dull red stain tinged the other man's cheeks. "Surely you understand my concern." "Your concern is unnecessary." Jarvis lifted a pinch of snuff to one nostril and sniffed. "Was there something else?" Kilmartin's fingers tightened around the brim of the hat he held in his hands. "No. Good day, sir." He swept a precisely calculated bow, turned on his heel, and left. Jarvis was still standing at the window, snuff-box in hand, when he heard an odd yelp from his clerk in the anteroom. An instant later, Viscount Devlin strode into the chamber without bothering to knock. "Do come in," said Jarvis dryly. A hard smile touched the younger man's lips. "Thank you." He was 30 years old now, tall and lean, with a vaguely menacing bearing that reminded one of the time he had spent as a cavalry officer. 2 years ago, Jarvis had sought to have the man killed. Jarvis little realized at the time how much he would eventually come to regret that rare failure. He slipped his snuff-box into his coat pocket and frowned. "How does my daughter?" "She's well." Jarvis grunted. His wife, Annabel, had exhibited numerous shortcomings over the years of their marriage, but by far her most grievous failure was her inability to provide Jarvis with a healthy male heir. Despite numerous miscarriages and stillbirths, she had succeeded in presenting him with only 2 children, a disappointingly sickly and idealistic son named David, who'd gone to a watery grave at the bottom of the sea, and Hero. Tall, strong, and brutally brilliant, Hero was exactly the sort of child who might have delighted Jarvis if she had been born a boy. As a daughter, however, she was far from satisfactory. Strong-willed, unapologetically bookish, and dangerously radical in her thinking, she had sworn off marriage at an early age and dedicated herself to a succession of appalling projects, only to allow herself to be impregnated by this bastard. Jarvis had never understood exactly what happened, but he uncharacteristically had no desire to know more about it than he already did. Now the 2 men faced each other across the width of the room, the air crackling with their mutual animosity. Devlin said, "What can you tell me about Armand Vaudreuil? And don't even think of trying to pretend you don't know him. I saw you together." Jarvis went to settle comfortably in the Louis XIV-style chair behind his desk. He stretched out his legs, crossed his ankles, rested his folded hands on his rather large stomach, and heaved an exaggerated sigh. "You've involved yourself in the death of that young French doctor, have you? What was his name again?" "Damien Pelletan." Somehow, when I heard a certain Irish surgeon had been so unfortunate as to discover the body, I knew you would feel compelled to interfere." "What has Vaudreuil to do with you?" "Nothing that is any of your affair." "Damien Pelletan's murder makes it my affair." Jarvis possessed an unexpectedly winsome smile he had long used to cajole or deceive the unwary. He used it now, although he knew Devlin was neither cajoled, nor deceived, nor unwary. Fortunately, Damien Pelletan's murder has been taken out of the hands of the bumbling East End authorities and turned over to Bow Street, by which I mean to the Chief Magistrate, Sir James, not to your good friend Sir Henry Lovejoy. So you see, there really is no need for you to involve yourself." Devlin, in turn, showed his teeth in a hard, nasty smile. "Concerned, are you?" "Partly. Sir James understands the delicacy of the situation." "Does he?" "Let's say that at least he understands enough to do what must be done." "Which is?" There will be no post-mortem. The body has already been removed from Gibson's surgery and turned over to Vaudreuil for burial. And that's to be it? I suggest you read the papers. Dr. Pelletan was brutally set upon by footpads. The Regent has expressed outrage at the growing boldness of the criminal class in the city, and an initiative will soon be launched to remove the worst of the ruffians from the streets. Those who make it a practice of attending the hangings at Newgate are in for some good sport in the months ahead. Devlin's eyes narrowed. He had the strangest eyes Jarvis had ever seen, the tawny gold of a tiger, with an unnatural, almost feral gleam. For some reason Jarvis couldn't have named, he suddenly found himself hoping that his coming grandson, or granddaughter, would not inherit this man's damned yellow eyes. And he silently cursed Hero again for having mixed their noble blood with that of this bastard. Devlin said, Armand Vaudreuil must be important. In and of himself, no. But what he stands for is very important indeed. Far more important than the death of some random physician. If you love your country, Devlin, you will heed me on this and leave well enough alone. Oh, I love my country, all right, said Devlin, but I've found that my vision for Britain and your vision are frequently two very different things. He turned toward the door. I'll tell Hero you were inquiring about her. Jarvis stood abruptly. I meant what I said. Do not involve yourself in this. Why? Devlin paused to look back at him. What are you concerned that I might find? But Jarvis simply shook his head, his nostrils quivering with the intensity of his dislike. Chapter 7. A diminutive but earnest man with a bald head and an abnormally high-pitched voice, Sir Henry Lovejoy was the newest of Bow Street's 3 stipendiary magistrates. Sebastian had heard that once he'd been a moderately prosperous merchant, until the deaths of his wife and daughter had driven him to dedicate his life to something outside of himself. But he spoke little of those early years, or of the family he'd lost, and the stern, somewhat controversial reformist religion that guided his life. In most ways, the two men could not have been more dissimilar, but there was no one whose integrity and honesty Sebastian trusted or admired more. Bow Street has received strict instructions from Carlton House that the residents of the Gifford Arms are under no circumstances to be approached, said Sir Henry, as the two men walked along the terrace of Somerset Place overlooking the Thames. A frigid wind was kicking up whitecaps on the turgid grey water and dashing the incoming tide against the embankment's walls. Sir James is adamant that the wishes of the palace be respected. There will be no investigation of Damien Pelleton's death, either officially or unofficially. Sebastian looked over at the magistrate. Ever hear of a murder victim in London having his heart cut out? Lovejoy pressed his lips into a tight straight line and shook his head. No, it's the most troublesome aspect of this killing, is it not? At least that ghastly detail has been kept out of the papers. It could cause a dangerous panic in the streets were it to become known. Then let us hope it doesn't happen again. Merciful heavens! Sir Henry pressed the folds of his handkerchief to his mouth. You think it might? I honestly don't know. Sebastian stared off across the river to where the jagged construction of the new bridge stood out stark against the heavy grey clouds. How much do you know about the other residents of the Gifford Arms? Specifically, Colonel Fouché and the clerk, Boudon. Nothing, frankly, but I could ask one of my constables to look into them. I don't believe the palace said anything in reference to making discreet inquiries about the residents of the inn. Sebastian ducked his head to hide his smile. The magistrate said, And the woman, I'm told, Paul Gibson found at the murder scene. Is she still alive? Last I heard. I'm on my way to Tower Hill now. Sir Henry thrust his hands deeper into his pockets and hunched his shoulders against the bitter wind. Perhaps if she regains consciousness, much of the mystery surrounding what happened will be solved. Perhaps, said Sebastian, although he doubted it. He suspected that if the unknown woman in Gibson's surgery could identify Pelletan's killer, she'd be dead. Returning to Tower Hill, Sebastian found Paul Gibson seated at his kitchen table and eating a plate of cold sliced mutton with boiled cabbage. Like the surgery beside it, Gibson's house faced onto the old cobbled lane that curled around the rear of the tower. The stone walls were thick, the ceilings heavily beamed and low, the floors uneven. Gibson employed a housekeeper named Mrs. Federico, although as far as Sebastian could tell, she did little beyond cook Gibson's meals and clean his kitchen. She refused to enter any room in which he kept his specimens. Since the surgeon had alcohol-filled jars containing any number of body parts and assorted oddities scattered around the house, her prejudice effectively restricted her to the passageway and the kitchen. But at the moment, the housekeeper was nowhere in sight. "Bad luck, I'm afraid," said Gibson as Sebastian poured himself some ale from the pitcher on the table and settled on the opposite bench. "A couple of constables from Bow Street came and took Pelletan's body away with them." "I heard. Did you get a chance to examine it at all?" Gibson shook his head and paused to swallow a mouthful of cabbage. "Not really, although I did discover how he died." "Oh?" "He was stabbed in the back with a dagger by someone who either knew what he was doing or got very lucky. The wound would have pierced the heart." "So he was dead before the killer hacked open his chest?" "Yes. Thank God for that, at least." Sebastian took a long, slow swallow of his ale. "Could you tell what the killer used to take out the heart?" "Probably a big kitchen knife, or a butcher knife." "Interesting," said Sebastian. Gibson looked up from cutting himself a slice of mutton. "Why's that? A dagger and a kitchen knife? Think about it. Who brings two knives to a murder?" Gibson chewed thoughtfully. "Someone who knows how to kill with a dagger, but realizes he needs a bigger knife to steal his victim's heart?" "Exactly. In other words, our killer planned to take Pelletan's heart." Sebastian nodded. "Bloody hell," Gibson said softly. "But why?" "That I can't even begin to guess." Gibson reached for the pitcher and poured them both more ale. "Did you go to Cat's Hole?" "I did." He told Gibson briefly what he had found there. "You didn't by chance find Pelletan's heart while you were having a look about, did you?" "No, but there was a pig rooting in the passage when I arrived." Gibson grimaced. "Bad luck, that." Pigs were notorious for eating anything and everything, human body parts included. "You didn't see the heart last night?" "No, but then I don't have your ability to see in the dark, and I was a wee bit preoccupied with other things." "How is your patient doing?" "She woke this morning long enough to tell me that her name is Alexandre Sauvage, and she has rooms in Golden Square. I've sent a message to her servant telling the woman her mistress is alive but injured." "Would it be possible for me to speak to her?" Gibson shook his head. She was restless and in pain, so I gave her a few drops of laudanum to help her sleep again. The possibility of bleeding in the brain still exists, so she needs to be kept as quiet as possible." "Do you think she'll survive?" Gibson looked troubled. "I don't know. It's still too early to say." Sebastian shifted his position to stretch out his legs and cross his boots at the ankles. "I had an interesting conversation with one Mitt Peebles at the Gifford Arms in York Street. It seems Damien Pelletan was with a small group of Frenchmen who hired the entire hotel 3 weeks ago. They then turned off most of the hotel staff and replace them with their own servants, their own French servants. Why would they do that? Presumably because they're worried about spies. I could be wrong, but I suspect Peloton was here as part of an official delegation sent by Napoleon to explore the possibility of peace with England. Gibson stared at him blankly. What? I recognize Monsieur Armand Vaudreuil, the man you say came to identify Peloton's body. I didn't know his name, but I've seen him before. With Jarvis. But peace? Is it possible? 6 months ago, I would have said no. But Napoleon just lost 500,000 men in Russia and barely escaped with his own life. The Prussians and the Austrians are turning against him, and there have been rumors of plots in Paris. I'm not surprised to hear he sent a small delegation to London with instructions to quietly put out peace feelers. And Alexandre Sauvage? I have no idea how she fits into any of this. But last night, a Frenchwoman and her male companion came to the hotel asking to see Peloton. He left shortly after talking to them. You think Alexandre Sauvage was that woman? It makes sense, doesn't it? So who was her companion? That I don't know. Gibson nudged away his plate. When she was awake, she told me why they were in St. Catherine's. Oh? She says Peloton had agreed to go with her to see a sick child who lives in Hangman's Court. She and Peloton were on their way back from visiting the little girl when they were attacked. Gibson pushed up from the table. I promised to go there this afternoon and take a look at the child. The mother's a poor widow. He looked over at Sebastian. Care to come along? Chapter 8. What's wrong with the child? Sebastian asked as they wound through St. Catherine's tangle of mean streets and dark, tortuous lanes. The sun was a distant golden ball in a frigid blue sky, but there was no warmth in its brittle light. Ice crusted the mud and manure beneath their feet, and the lips of the grimy, ragged children playing in the gutters were blue with cold. It's a little girl of 3. I'm told she was healthy enough until recently. She had the sniffles and a slight rash a couple of weeks ago, but seemed to get over it. Then suddenly she couldn't move her legs. She's been getting progressively weaker and weaker, with the weakness slowly moving up her body, first to her back, then to her arms. Last night she was having difficulty breathing. It sounds as if something is affecting the muscles in her body, and now it's hit the walls of her chest. Sounds frightening, said Sebastian. Gibson threw him a quick glance. For a parent, it would be terrifying, yes? They walked on in silence. This was one of the poorest sections of London, its streets crowded with low, squalid tenements built of decaying wood and mean shops that catered to the nearby docks. The wretched space known as Hangman's Court lay not far from the spires of the old medieval church. A question addressed to an aged woman selling roasted potatoes from a rusty barrow brought them to a warped door at the end of a dark, fetid corridor. From the other side of the panels came the sound of a woman weeping. Gibson knocked quietly, almost apologetically. The sobs ceased abruptly. "Madame Bisset," he called. "Alexandre Sauvage asked me to call. I'm a surgeon." They heard a soft, hesitant tread, then the sound of a bolt being drawn back. The door swung inward to reveal a woman. She looked to be perhaps 35 or 40, although it was impossible to say with any certainty. Her face was blotched with tears, her eyes red and swollen, her lips trembling. Rail-thin, she wore a rusty black old-fashioned gown, relatively clean but hopelessly threadbare. The small room beyond her was icy cold and empty, except for a rough pallet in the corner, on which lay a tiny form, ominously still. "Madame Bisset?" asked Gibson, his hat in his hands. Oui. His gaze went to the child on the pallet. How is she? The woman began to weep again. Sebastian walked over to the pallet, gazed down at the dead child, and shook his head. I'm sorry, said Gibson. My Cecile, wailed the woman, her arms wrapping around her waist, her body curling forward with the agony of her grief. She was all I had left. What am I to do now? What? Our apologies for disturbing you at such a time, said Sebastian, going to press several coins into her palm and close her fingers around them. The woman stared dully at the coins in her hand, then lifted her gaze to his face. Her English was only lightly accented, her voice cultured and educated. She might be living in extreme poverty now, but she was obviously not born to it. She said, Why are you here? Where is Alexis? Her use of a pet form of Alexandrie Sauvage's given name surprised him, hinting at an intimacy between the two women he hadn't expected. Sebastian said, Madame Sauvage and Dr. Pelleton were attacked in Cat's Hole after they left here last night. Dr. Pelleton was killed. Madame Bisset sucked in a quick breath. And Alexis? She was badly injured, said Gibson, but I've hoped she'll recover. He hesitated, then added, Do you know of any reason why someone might have wanted to kill Dr. Pelleton? The woman shook her head. I never knew Damien Pelleton. The doctoress asked him to look at Cecile. Sebastian and Gibson exchanged glances. Sebastian said, Alexandrie Sauvage is a physician. She is, yes. She studied at Bologna. Medical schools were closed to women in both France and in England, but Italy had a tradition of female physicians that dated back to the Middle Ages. How long has she been in London? Asked Sebastian. A year, perhaps more. As a woman, of course, she cannot be licensed to practice medicine here, and is only allowed to act as a midwife. But she is a good woman. She does what she can to help those in the French community. Again, Sebastian's gaze met Gibson's. I wonder how she came to know Pelleton, he said quietly. The dead child's mother began to weep again, clutching her ragged shawl about her and rocking back and forth. Sebastian reached out awkwardly to touch her thin shoulder. Again, madame, our heartfelt condolences for your loss, and our apologies for disturbing you at such a time. She sniffed, her spine stiffening with an echo of a pride long worn down and effaced. Merci, monsieur, she said, holding out the coins he had given her, but I cannot accept your charity. He made no move to take the money. It's not mine. The doctoress asked me to give it to you. He could tell by the narrowing of her eyes that she knew it for a lie. But it was a lie she was obviously desperate enough to accept, because she swallowed hard and nodded, her gaze sliding away as she said, Merci. They were retracing their steps back down the dank, noisome corridor when they heard the door jerk open behind them again. Monsieur, she called out, stopping them. You asked about Damien Pelleton? They turned toward her again. Yes. Why? She scrubbed the heel of one thin hand over her wet cheeks. When he and the doctoress were here last night for Cecile, I heard them talking. I did not pay attention to most of what was said, but one name they mentioned several times leapt out at me. What name is that? Marie-Thérèse, the Duchesse d'Angoulême. Gibson stared at her. You mean the daughter of Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI of France? Yes. Sebastian said, What about Marie-Thérèse? The woman shook her head. I did not hear most of what was said. My attention was all for Cécile. But I believe they were discussing a meeting between Damien Pelletan and the Princess. A meeting that worried Alexandre Sauvage. Chapter 9. "How much do you know about Marie-Thérèse?" Sebastian asked Gibson as they walked up St. Catherine's Lane toward the looming bulk of the parish's decrepit medieval church. Gibson frowned. "Not much. I know she was thrown into the Temple prison with her parents during the Revolution and kept there even after the King and Marie Antoinette were sent to the guillotine. But that's about it. Her brother died there, didn't he?" "So they say. But for some reason I've never entirely understood, the revolutionaries allowed Marie-Thérèse to live. When she was 17, they released her to the Austrians in exchange for some French prisoner of war. And now she's here, in England." Sebastian nodded. "Most of the French royal family is here, or at any rate, what's left of it. Louis XVI's youngest brother, Artois, has a house on South Audley Street, but the rest live on a small estate out in Buckinghamshire." "What's the older brother's name? The one who's so heavy he can hardly walk?" "That's Provence." Although princes of the blood, the two surviving brothers of Louis XVI were both generally known by the titles given them at birth, the Comte de Provence and the Comte d'Artois. Both had fled France early in the Revolution, but whether one saw their flights as cowardly or wise tended to reflect one's politics. As a female, Marie-Thérèse was barred by French law from inheriting her father's crown. But after her release from prison, she had married her first cousin, the Duc d'Angoulême, third in line to the French throne behind his childless uncle and his own father. Thus, as Angoulême's wife, Marie-Thérèse would someday become Queen of France, if there was a restoration. Earnest and plodding, Angoulême was said to be not nearly as bright as his wife. The last Sebastian had heard, the young French prince was off with Wellington in Spain, while Artois was with his latest mistress up in Edinburgh. But there were more than enough Bourbons and their hangers-on around London to cause mischief. "So what's she like, this princess?" Gibson asked. "Very devout, like her father, Louis XVI. Arrogant and proud, like her mother, Marie Antoinette. And slightly mad, thanks to her experiences during the Revolution. She has devoted her life to the restoration of the Bourbons and the punishment of those she holds responsible for the deaths of her family. I've heard it said she's convinced it is God's will that the Bourbons will someday be restored to France. And the Revolution and Napoleon are what, just an unpleasant interlude?" "Something like that." They paused before the church of St. Catherine's, Sebastian tipping back his head to let his gaze drift over the West End's soaring buttresses and delicately hued stained-glass windows. Time and shifting politics had not been kind to the graceful old structure. The roof beams sagged, tufts of moss and grass grew from the crumbling stone facade, and black holes showed where the visages of saints had, in better days, smiled down upon the common people. Once this had been the chapel of a religious community, founded and patronized by the Queens of England. Then had come Reformation, Civil War, Revolution, and neglect. "What?" asked Gibson, watching him. "I was thinking about revolutions and queens." Gibson shook his head, not understanding. "If England were to make peace with France now, then Napoleon would remain emperor. I can't see that going down well with Louis XVI's daughter. She wants revenge on the men who murdered her mother and father, and she has ambitions of someday becoming Queen of France herself. So what the bloody hell was she doing meeting with a man who formed part of a French peace delegation? It is curious, is it not?" Sebastian turned away from the ancient soot-stained church. "I think I'd like to have a chat with Madame Sauvage's servant. Where did you say she lives? Golden Square?" Gibson nodded. You can tell her that her mistress is doing as well as can be expected. When will she be out of danger? Gibson stared out over the rows of mossy tombstones in the swollen churchyard beside them. "I wish I knew," he said, his face looking bleak and drawn. "I wish I knew." Lying some blocks to the east of Bond Street, Golden Square had never been particularly fashionable. Built in the waning days of the Stuarts, its varied rooflines were more reminiscent of 18th-century Parisian hotels or the decorative gables of Amsterdam than of London townhouses. Once it had been home to foreign ambassadors and artists, but a dull, dingy look had long ago settled over the area, with many of the 17th-century brick and stucco houses broken up into lodgings. Sebastian spent some time talking to vendors and shopkeepers around the square, including a butler, an apothecary, and one stout middle-aged woman with a gummy smile who sold eel pies from a stall. Madame Sauvage seemed to be a well-liked figure in the neighbourhood, although no one knew much about her. "She's a deep one," said the eel-seller, giving Sebastian a wink. "Friendly enough, but keeps herself to herself for all that." The Frenchwoman's rooms lay on the attic floor of a 4-story, gable-fronted house near the corner of Upper James Street. Sebastian's knock was answered by a plain, heavy-set woman with iron-grey hair and a knobby nose, who peered at him suspiciously, her gaze travelling over him with obvious disapproval. "Madame Sauvage is not here," she said in a heavy accent typical of the Basque region of France, and made as if to close the door. Sebastian stopped it by resting his forearm against the panel, then softened the aggression of the move with a smile. "I know. My friend Paul Gibson is caring for her at his surgery." The woman hesitated, her instinctive wariness at war with an obvious desire to obtain information about her mistress. Concern for her mistress won. "You know how she does?" "The surgeon is hopeful she will recover, although she's not yet out of danger." The woman's lips parted, and she exhaled sharply as if she'd been holding her breath. "Why has she not been brought here to me, so that I may care for her?" "I've no doubt you're more than capable," said Sebastian. "Unfortunately, she can't yet be moved." The woman folded her arms beneath her massive bosom. "Well, you tell that surgeon that as soon as she's well enough, he's to send her home to Carmela." Sebastian said, "Have you been with the doctoress long?" He saw a flicker of surprise, followed by a return of her earlier wariness. "How do you know she's a doctoress?" "Madame Bisset told me. I'm trying to find out who might have wanted to harm her or Dr. Pelleton, the man who was with her last night." "And why should you care? A fine English gentleman such as yourself?" "I care," he said simply. She pursed her mouth and said nothing. "When did you last see her?" he asked. 5, perhaps 6 o'clock last night. She left to visit some patients." "Alone?" "Yes, of course." From one of the floors below came a child's shout, followed by a trill of delighted laughter. Sebastian said, "Do you know if she had any enemies? Someone with whom she might have quarrelled recently?" The woman was silent, her lips pressed tightly together, her nostrils flaring on a deeply indrawn breath. "There is someone, isn't there? Who is it?" Carmela cast a quick, furtive glance around the dark corridor, then beckoned Sebastian inside and quickly shut the door behind him. "His name is Bullock." She dropped her voice as if still wary that she might somehow be overheard. "He's been watching her, following her." "Why?" "He blames her for his brother's death, that's why. Said he was going to make her pay, he did." "She treated the man's brother?" Carmela shook her head. "Not his brother, no. His brother's wife." "What happened to her?" "She died." Sebastian let his gaze roam the attic's low-sloped ceiling and dingy papered walls. The space was fitted out as a small sitting room, but judging from the rolled pallet in the corner and the cooking utensils near the hearth, it also served as the kitchen and Carmela's bedroom. Through an open door on the far side, he caught a glimpse of a second chamber, barely large enough to hold a narrow bed, and a small chest. The few pieces of furniture in the 2 rooms looked old and worn. A thin, tattered carpet covered the floor, and the walls were bare of all decoration except for one small, cracked mirror. As if aware of Sebastian's scrutiny, the woman said, "C'est dommage." She caught herself, then carefully switched to English. "It is a pity what she is reduced to. She was born to better than this." "I understand she came to London last year," said Sebastian in French. The woman blinked in surprise, but answered readily enough in the same language. "October 1811 it was. She came with her husband, the English captain." "She was married to an English officer?" "She was, yes. Captain Miles Sauvage. Met him in Spain, she did." "And where is Captain Sauvage now?" "He died, not more than 6 weeks after we came here." "You were with her in Spain?" "I was. Yes." Her tone was once again guarded, her jaw set hard. Rather than press her on the point, Sebastian shifted to a different tack. "Tell me more about this man you say has been threatening her." "Bullock." Her heavy brows drew together in a thoughtful frown. "He's a tradesman. Has a shop somewhere hereabouts. Big bear of a man he is, with curly black hair and a nasty scar running across his cheek like this." She brought up her left hand to slash diagonally from the outer edge of her eye to the corner of her mouth. "And apart from Bullock, can you think of anyone else who might have wished her harm?" "No, no one. Why would anyone want to hurt her?" "And did you know Dr. Damien Pelletan?" She hesitated a moment, then shook her head. "No." "You're certain?" "How would I know him?" she demanded, staring belligerently back at Sebastian. "Do you know if Madame Sauvage had any contact with the exiled Bourbons?" A slow tide of angry red crept up the woman's neck. "Those puces! What would the doctoress want with them? She hates them." "Really?" It was an unusual attitude for a French émigré. "Well," said the woman hastily, as if regretting her harsh words, "I suppose the Comte de Provence is not so bad when all is said and done. But Artois—" Her face contorted with the violence of her loathing. "And that Marie-Thérèse! She's not right in the head, that one. She lives still in the 18th century, and she wishes to drag France back to the past with her. Do you know what the doctoress calls her?" Sebastian shook his head. "Madame Rancune. That's what the doctoress calls her. Madame Rancune." Rancune. It was a French word meaning grudge or rancour, and it carried with it more than a hint of vindictiveness and spite. He'd heard Marie-Thérèse called it before. Madame Resentment. Chapter 10. By the time Sebastian left Golden Square, the weak winter sun was disappearing fast behind a thick bank of clouds that bunched low over the city, stealing the light from the afternoon and sending the temperature plummeting. He walked up Swallow Street, trying to make sense of a murder investigation that seemed to be going in 3 different directions at once. The next logical step would be to speak to Marie-Thérèse, the Duchesse d'Angoulême herself. But the daughter of the last crowned King of France was currently living at Hartwell House in Buckinghamshire, nearly 40 miles to the northwest of London. Under normal circumstances he would have driven out there without a second thought. But a journey of that length presented logistical problems for a man whose wife was heavily pregnant with their first child. After careful calculations, he decided that if he left London at dawn, driving his own curricle, but with hired teams changed at 12 to 14-mile intervals, he could make it there and back by early afternoon. He altered his direction and turned toward the livery stables in Boyle Street. "6 teams," said the livery stable's owner, a gnarled little Irishman named O'Malley, who'd made quite a name for himself as a jockey some decades before. "To go less than 80 miles? You don't think that might be a wee bit excessive, my lord?" "I plan to make it there and back in 6 hours," said Sebastian. O'Malley grinned. "Well, if anyone can do it, you can, my lord." He scratched the back of his neck. "I reckon I've just the team for your first stage. Real sweet goers they are, all fours, creamy white and well-matched as 2 twins' breasts. And if you've a mind to it, I could send one of me lads on ahead tonight to make sure you get the best cattle at every change, there and back." "I would appreciate that," said Sebastian, his gaze scanning the slice of street visible through the stable's open doorway. He'd been aware of a vague niggling sensation of unease ever since he left Golden Square. Now, as he studied the steady stream of wagons, carriages, and carts that filled the street, whips cracking, iron-rimmed wheels rattling over paving stones, he identified the source of that unease. He was being watched. He couldn't have said by whom, but he had no doubt that he was the object of someone's intense scrutiny. "Them clouds might look nasty," said O'Malley, misunderstanding his concern, "but me bones say we won't be getting no snow for a day or so yet." "I hope your bones are right." "Ach, ain't never failed me yet, they haven't. Broke both me legs and an arm back in 87, I did. The surgeon was all for hacking off the lot of 'em, but I told him I'd rather be dead. He swore I would be soon enough, but I proved him wrong. Been over 25 years now, and I ain't been surprised by the weather since." Sebastian cast a last glance at the darkening, wind-scoured street, then turned away. "Now let's have a look at those sweet-goers of yours, shall we?" The creamy white team proved to be every bit as impressive as O'Malley had said they would be. Sebastian settled with the stable owner, then walked out into the noisy bustle of Boyle Street. He could see an organ grinder standing at the corner. Nearby, a blind beggar, aged and stooped, shook his cup plaintively at the press of tradesmen and apprentices hurrying past. A girl with a tray full of frost-nipped watercress, her face pinched with cold, called, "Light me a bunch." He studied each in turn, but he couldn't recall having seen any of them in Golden Square. Every fibre of his being, alert and tense, he turned toward home, but the unpleasant sense of being watched slowly evaporated, like the lingering memories of an unpleasant dream. Sebastian returned to Brook Street to find Hero seated in one of the cane chairs at the drawing-room's front bow window, a lighted candle on the table beside her, her head tipped to one side as she studied a sheet crowded with names and qualifications. The big, long-haired black cat who had adopted them some months before slept curled up on the hearth. He paused in the doorway for a moment, just for the pleasure of looking at her. She was an unusually tall woman, with large, clear grey eyes, an aquiline nose, and the kind of strong facial structure that was generally described as handsome rather than pretty. He had disliked her intensely the first time he met her. Now he wondered how he could ever live without her. She looked up, caught him watching her, and smiled. "What's this?" he asked, going to peer over her shoulder. "A list of nursery maids suggested by the agency." She frowned and set the page aside. "I don't like the idea of entrusting my child to some young, ignorant country girl who's barely more than a child herself." He went to warm his hands at the fire. The cat glanced up at him through slitted eyes, then settled back to sleep. "So, tell them you want someone older and educated." "I intend to." He turned to face her. "I'm planning to drive out to Buckinghamshire in the morning. If I change teams twice on the way out and 3 times on the return journey, I should be back in London by mid-afternoon at the latest. But if you feel uncomfortable about me going out of town, I won't." She looked at him in confusion. Why would I? Enlightenment dawned, and she gave a startled trill of laughter. "Good heavens, Devlin! I hope you don't mean because of the babe?" "I don't want you to be left alone. I have a house full of servants, and the best accoucheur in London ready to rush to my side at a moment's notice. I will not be alone. Apart from which, this babe isn't coming any time soon. So certain. I have it on the authority of Richard Croft himself. And if you insist on hovering about me until it does come, you're liable to drive me mad." He gave a rueful smile. "Well, I certainly wouldn't want to do that." She pushed to her feet, the swelling weight of the child making the movement awkward, and went to draw the drapes against the coming night. "Where in Buckinghamshire?" "Hartwell House." She paused to look at him over one shoulder. "Good heavens! You think the Bourbons could somehow be involved in Damien Pelletan's death?" "They might be." He told her of his visit to the Gifford Arms Hotel, and the conversation Madame Bisset had overheard the night of Pelletan's murder, and his own less-than-productive confrontation with Jarvis. "Do you know anything about a peace delegation from Paris?" he asked, watching her closely. "No, but I'll see what I can find out." "Jarvis won't tell you anything." "Not now." She gave him a smile that curled the edges of her lips and brought a secretive gleam to the shadowy depths of her intense grey eyes. "I don't intend to ask Jarvis." That evening, as he was preparing to make an early start the following morning, Sebastian sent for his valet. Jules Calhoun was a slim, elegant gentleman's gentleman in his early 30s, with straight flaxen hair and twinkling eyes. Affable and extraordinarily clever, he was a genius at repairing the ravages the pursuit of murderers could sometimes wreak on Sebastian's wardrobe. But for all his skill with boot-blacking and starch, Calhoun was no ordinary valet. Born in one of the worst flash houses in London, he was familiar with parts of the city and segments of its population that would cause most valets to shudder with horror. "Ever hear of a man named Bullock?" Sebastian asked. "I'm told he's a big scar-faced tradesman with a shop somewhere in the vicinity of Golden Square." Calhoun shook his head. "I don't believe so, my lord. I can look into him, if you wish." Sebastian nodded, but cautiously. "I understand he has a nasty disposition." Chapter 11. Saturday, 23rd of January. Sebastian left London before dawn, driving O'Malley's team of fast, creamy whites, and with his own young groom, or tiger, Tom, clinging to the perch at the rear of the curricle. The boy had been with Sebastian for 2 years now, ever since he'd tried to pick Sebastian's pocket in a low St. Giles tavern. Sebastian had been on the run at the time, charged with a murder he didn't commit. The young street urchin had saved Sebastian's life, although Tom always contended they were more than even. They drove through misty, flat meadows filled with frost-whitened grass, and sleepy villages with stone-walled, thatched-roof cottages and wind-ruffled mill-ponds, where ducks foraged amongst the freeze-nipped rees that grew in the shallows. The sun rose in a muted pink haze above winter-bared stands of elm and birch, and still they pressed on, the team's galloping hooves eating up the miles, their heaving sides dark with sweat by the time Tom blew up for the change. "We ain't never going to make Hartwell House in 3 hours," said Tom, critically eyeing the new team as it was put to. Sebastian snapped shut his watch and smiled. "Yes, we will." They made it in just under 2 hours and 50 minutes. An elegant, small manor dating to the time of the Tudors, Hartwell House had been hired by the exiled Bourbons some 4 years before. Sebastian had heard that Sir George Lee, the owner, was not happy with the treatment his estate was receiving at the hands of the royals. As Sebastian drew up his curricle on the ragged gravel sweep before the manor's small porch, he thought he could understand why. Crude new windows had been punched through the venerable old stone walls, while tattered laundry hung out to dry on the roof flapped in the cold wind. What was once a grand sweep of turf had been torn up here and there, and planted with vegetables. The bleat of goats and the cluck-clucking of chickens filled the air. "Looks worse than a bleeding back court in St. Giles," said Tom, scrambling forward to take the reins. "Not exactly Versailles, is it?" Tom scrunched up his sharp-boned face in puzzlement. "For what?" "Versailles. It's the grand palace that was home to the kings of France until the revolutionaries dragged the royal family into Paris in 1789. "Oh." The tiger didn't look impressed, but then Tom had no use for foreigners in general, and the French in particular. Sebastian dropped lightly to the ground. "Do keep your ears open around the stables, will you?" Tom broke into a gap-toothed grin. "Of course, governor." Still smiling faintly to himself, Sebastian turned toward the manor's small, somewhat shabby portico. Virtually anyone else driving out from London uninvited to see the daughter of the last crowned king of France would most likely have been curtly rebuffed. But not Sebastian St. Cyr, heir to the powerful Earl of Hendon, Chancellor of the Exchequer. The estrangement between the Earl and his heir might be well known, but few understood its reasons, and no impoverished European royal was going to risk alienating the member of the cabinet responsible for all economic and financial matters. As a result, Sebastian waited in the dingy vestibule for only a few minutes before a powdered footman in threadbare livery appeared to escort him back outside and around the far wing of the house to where Marie-Thérèse, Charlotte, daughter of France, waited to receive him at the entrance to a long topiary arcade that stretched toward a silver shimmer of water in the distance. She'd been standing with one of her ladies, her gaze on the canal, but at his approach she turned and nodded her dismissal of the footman. Sebastian had met her before at various London balls and dinners. On those occasions she had always been every inch the king's daughter, dressed in velvets and silks, and dripping the diamonds and pearls that her mother, Marie Antoinette, had managed to smuggle out of France with friends in the early days of the Revolution. Today she wore a somewhat shabby gown of dark green wool, made high at the neck with only a modest touch of lace at the collar and cuffs. An unfashionable, heavy wool shawl draped her shoulders. But her carriage was eminently regal, her head held high as she moved to meet him. "Lord Devlin," she said, her voice oddly high-pitched and scratchy, and still noticeably inflected by her native Parisian accent. "How kind of you to call." He bowed low over the hand she offered. "Thank you for agreeing to see me on such short notice." She inclined her head, but didn't smile. He had heard that she never smiled. Although she was still known in the popular imagination as the orphan in the temple, those days were long in the past. She was 34 years old. As a child she'd been blonde and blue-eyed, but her hair had long since darkened to a dull brown. She had a tall, sloping forehead, a long nose, protuberant, red-rimmed eyes, and a somewhat receding chin. There was little of her mother's famous beauty or vivacity about her, although Marie Antoinette's disastrous haughtiness was very much in evidence. Turning, she indicated the woman who had until then remained quietly in the background. "This is my dear companion, Lady Giselle Edmondson." Lady Giselle was of much the same age as the princess, but both taller and more delicately built, with hair of the palest blonde and an almost elfin face. The daughter of an English earl and his French wife, she had been born in Paris to an idyllic childhood of soft eiderdowns, lavender-scented gardens, and rose-tinged sunrises over the Seine. A devotee of the Enlightenment, the Earl had greeted the first stirrings of revolution with an enthusiasm bordering on delirium. The storming of the Bastille troubled him, but he'd scornfully refused to join the panicked stampede of his fellow aristocrats for the Channel. By the time the gutters flowed with blood, and matted blonde hair streamed from the heads of noble women carried on pikes through the streets, it was too late. Gathering his young family, he tried to flee on a dark, wind-swept night, but they made it less than 30 miles before a howling mob surrounded their carriage. As 13-year-old Giselle watched with the faces of her younger brother and sister pressed tight against her skirts, the Earl and his wife were dragged from their carriage and torn limb from limb. Then the jeering, red-capped men and snarling women wrenched the children from her arms. "We'll raise them as good sans-culottes," they told her. Sebastian had heard she spent the next 3 years searching for her little brother and sister, but she never found them. By the time she finally left France, in the train of the newly freed Marie-Thérèse, she was just 16. She had never married, but somehow she'd managed to come to terms with the horrors of her past and achieve an enviable measure of serenity. Unlike Marie-Thérèse, she did not clutch her sorrows to her or wear her sufferings as a badge of honor. "We have met," she told Sebastian now with a warmth that was utterly lacking in the princess, but only once, and very briefly, so I doubt you would remember it. "The Duchess of Claiborne's ball last June," he said, returning her smile. She gave a startled peal of laughter. "Good heavens! How can you possibly recall it?" He remembered, because he'd found her life story so hauntingly tragic, and the degree to which she'd managed to overcome its worst effects inspiring. But all he said was, "Reports of my lamentable memory are greatly exaggerated." She started to laugh again, then cast an almost apologetic glance toward the princess, and raised a hand to her lips as if hiding her smile. "Let us walk," said the princess, turning their steps toward the canal in the distance. "Tell me, my lord, how does your wife?" Sebastian was aware of Lady Giselle falling in several steps behind them. "She is well, thank you," he said. "I hear she is with child. Congratulations." "Thank you." "And married such a short time? Your wife is fortunate indeed." Her hand fluttered to touch, ever so briefly, her own flat stomach, an unconscious movement that was there and then gone. She had been married something like 13 years, yet had never conceived. He'd heard it said she remained convinced that God would someday send her a child who would continue the Bourbon line. But time was running out, both for Marie-Thérèse and for her dynasty. She said, "You do realize that I know why you are here?" "Do you?" "You have made the investigation of murder your special interest, have you not? And a Frenchman named Pelletan was murdered on the streets of London 2 nights ago." "You were acquainted with Dr. Damien Pelletan?" "You are obviously aware of the fact that I was. Otherwise, why are you here?" When Sebastian remained silent, she said, "He was a physician of some renown in Paris, you know." "No, I didn't know." She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead. "I thought it might be worth my while to consult with him." "Somehow, I had the impression Dr. Pelletan was not a royalist." He watched her mouth tighten. "No," she said, "he was not. But he was nevertheless an excellent physician." Sebastian studied her fiercely proud profile. She was a woman who had been trained from infancy to dissemble, to never show her true thoughts or emotions. Yet there was no disguising the intense anger that smouldered beneath her carefully correct exterior. He said, "I wonder, Do you know a man by the name of Armand Vaudreuil?" He expected her to deny it. Instead, she curled her lip and said, "Fortunately, I have never personally encountered the man, but I have heard of him, yes. A vulgar parvenu, who believes himself the equal of his betters. There are many such in the government of France these days. But by the grace of God, all will soon be dispersed. Once the Bourbons are restored to their rightful position, Vaudreuil and his kind will be like so many roaches, fleeing before the bright light of God's divine will." Sebastian kept his own features carefully bland. "What about a Frenchwoman, Alexandre Sauvage? Do you know her?" "Sauvage?" Marie-Thérèse drew up at the end of the allée and pivoted to look him full in the face. "I do not believe so, no," she said with perfect calm. "And now you must excuse me. I wish to walk on alone. Lady Giselle will accompany you back to the house." And she turned on her heel and left him there, her head held high, her spine stiff as she strode determinedly away. "I'm sorry. She's rather tense today," said Lady Giselle, coming up beside him. In Sebastian's experience, Marie-Thérèse was always tense, but all he said was, "I suspect I'm quite capable of finding my way back to the house without assistance, if you would rather go after her." Lady Giselle shook her head. She meant it when she said she wishes to be alone. They turned to walk side by side back down the alley. After a moment, Lady Giselle said, "I know many find the princess cold and stiff, even aloof. But she truly is an admirable woman, strong and devout. Her days are spent helping her uncle or visiting establishments for the relief of orphans and the poor." "Is that what she did this last Thursday?" "Last Thursday? Oh, no. Thursday was the 21st of January. "The date is significant." She looked vaguely surprised, then let out her breath in a rush. "Ah! Just because you're not French, that is why you do not know. Marie-Thérèse's father, King Louis XVI of France, was guillotined at 10 o'clock on the morning of January the 21st, 1793. Did you know she has the chemise he wore when he was killed? His confessor saved it for her. It is still stained dark with his blood. Every year, on the anniversary of his death, she closets herself with the chemise in her room and spends the day in prayer. She does the same on the anniversary of her mother's murder as well." 20 years, thought Sebastian. Her parents had been dead for 20 years, and she had yet to put those dark days behind her and learn to embrace the joys of the living. He wondered if Lady Giselle passed the anniversary of her own parents' deaths closeted in prayer with a bloody relic. Somehow he doubted it. Aloud he said, "She stays in prayer all day, from before dawn until midnight. She does not leave her room, not even for meals. Her uncle always has trays sent up for her, but she never touches them." So she spent Thursday alone. They had reached the long eastern facade of the house, its elegant row of recessed, arched windows forming an incongruous backdrop to the tethered goats and flocks of chickens. She pivoted to face him, her eyes narrowed, her head tilting to one side as she regarded him intently. "What precisely are you suggesting, my lord? That the daughter of the martyred King of France gave us all the slip and crept out to murder some insignificant Parisian physician in a London back alley?" When Sebastian remained silent, she gave a humorless laugh and said, "But since you asked, I will answer your question. No, she did not spend the day alone. Every January 21st, since her release from prison, I have been at her side, praying with her and holding her when she weeps. No one has ever seen Marie-Thérèse weep in public, and no one ever will, just as no one will ever know the torment she bears in private. He became aware of the creak-creak of a wheeled chair carrying an enormously obese man toward them from around the side of the house. It was pushed not by a footman, but by a thin, foppishly dressed gentleman with a narrow, delicate face, a halo of chestnut-coloured curls, and the steady, relentless gaze of a man who decided long ago to meet the world on his own terms and shrug off the consequences. Lady Giselle cast a quick glance toward the wheeled chair. Then she gathered her skirts in a clenched fist. "Good day, my lord." Sebastian stood on the ragged lawn and watched her long-legged strides scatter the bleating goats and squawking disgruntled chickens as if she were chased by the squeak of the wheeled chair, rolling ever closer. Chapter 12. Sebastian nudged away a speckled hen that was showing rather too much interest in the shiny toe of one of his Hessians, and walked forward to meet the wheeled chair bearing the uncrowned King of France. He'd been born Louis Stanislaus, fourth in line to the French throne, and given the title Comte de Provence. No one ever expected the plump, self-indulgent Comte de Provence to someday be king. And so he was allowed to go his own way, neglecting his studies, amassing staggering debts, and growing fatter every year. His younger brother, the Comte d'Artois, was slim, dashing, and handsome. But not Provence. Even as a young man he'd been obese. Now in his late 50s and crippled by gout, he could barely walk without assistance. "Devlin!" he cried when he was still some feet away. "Don't run off yet. I want a word with you." "Your Majesty," said Sebastian with an elegant bow. The Comte de Provence laughed, his plump, rosy-cheeked face still surprisingly youthful, and creased with a smile of habitual good cheer. "How very diplomatic of you, young man, and without a moment's hesitation, too. Most people in your position hem and haw in painful indecision. You can almost see the agonized thoughts tumbling one after the other through their heads. Do I address him as if he were indeed the crowned King of France, rather than an impoverished exile? Should I call him the Comte de Provence, or should I follow Napoleon's lead, and refer to him as the Comte d'Ille?" The Bourbon's enormous protuberant belly bounced up and down. "At least I have yet to have anyone address me the way my niece styles Napoleon, as the criminal." "Does she really?" "Oh, yes, she has for years." Twisting awkwardly in his chair, he reached up with noticeable tenderness to touch the right hand of the man pushing him. "Ambrose, if you would be so kind. A walk toward the chapel might afford the most privacy, don't you agree?" Ambrose Lachapelle glanced over at Sebastian, a faint enigmatic smile curling his lips. "Oh, most definitely." Sebastian had met Lachapelle before. Born into an aristocratic family in Avignon, he'd fled France as a youth to fight in the counter-revolutionary émigré army led by the Prince de Condé. When the army was disbanded, he joined the Comte de Provence in exile, first in Russia, then in Warsaw, where he'd risen quickly in his royal master's favour. Sebastian had heard that he owed his rapid elevation to his willingness to do anything for his uncrowned king. Anything. "Your father and I were good friends in our youth, you know," Provence said, his voice raised so as to be heard above the squeak of the chair's wheels and the crunch of the weed-choked gravel beneath their feet. The winter-bared oaks and elms in the neglected park closed in around them, dark and sombre in the flat light. "No, I didn't know," said Sebastian. The Bourbon's eyes practically disappeared behind his puffy, smiling lids. "Hendon never told you about his salad days in Paris, did he?" He tried to laugh, but it quickly degenerated into a rasping cough. "Golden years those were, golden! Horses, jewels, chateaux, carriages, wine. We had it all. I once ran up a debt of 1,000,000 livres, and my brother the king paid it off. Think of that, 1,000,000 livres. What I wouldn't give for that kind of money now. We thought those days would never end, but they did. He cast Sebastian a quick sideways glance. I suppose you think we should have seen it coming, and so we should have. So we should. I tell Marie-Thérèse all the time that when 2% of a nation has all the wealth, and the other 98% of the people pay all the taxes, a bloodbath is inevitable. Inevitable. Sebastian had heard that an intense and at times acrimonious disagreement raged within the French royal family. The Comte de Provence favoured a limited parliamentary monarchy and was willing to give numerous concessions to the people of France if they would only allow him to return. But both Marie-Thérèse and Provence's own younger brother Charles, Comte d'Artois, were ultra-royalists, stubbornly adhering to their belief in the divine right of kings, and insisting upon nothing less than a reimposition of absolute monarchy. Sebastian said, "In my experience, most people tend to believe, even in the face of all the evidence to the contrary, that things will never change." The Bourbon sighed. "True. True. Although I've been exiled from France for more than 20 years now. So, God willing, this is one state of affairs that will change, and soon. I would not like to die on foreign soil." "The news from the continent sounds encouraging, if you can call the slaughter of 500,000 men encouraging." The Bourbon's jovial face went slack. "Ghastly, is it not? All those dead men strewn across Russia." The genuine depth of his grief took Sebastian by surprise. He found himself wondering if Marie-Thérèse had ever spared a moment's sorrow for the war dead of the nation over which she hoped one day to reign as queen. Somehow he doubted it. She was too busy hugging her own misery and loss to herself. As if aware of the drift of his thoughts, Provence said, "But you did not come all the way out here to discuss either philosophy or my long-lost youth, did you?" Sebastian smiled. "No, sir. I wonder, have you ever heard of a young French doctor named Damien Pelletan?" "Ha!" Provence slapped the arm of his chair in triumph. "That's why you're here, isn't it? Told you so, Ambrose, didn't I?" Sebastian glanced at the courtier, who kept his gaze trained straight ahead, his features composed in an expressionless mask. "So you did know him?" "Me? No." Provence nodded toward a small red brick building half hidden by a nearby stand of oaks. "Look at that. See it? I'm told that at one time it was a rectory. Now it is home to a duke, 2 counts, their wives and children, their aged mothers, and their unwed or widowed sisters and their children. There isn't an outbuilding on the estate that isn't overflowing. Barns, stables, even an old Gothic folly in the gardens. In the main house itself we've had to divide chambers and erect partitions in the gallery. I occupy what was once a small study off the library. Marie-Thérèse has an apartment next to the muniment room, and the exiled King of Sweden is in the chapel. More than 200 people live here. Think about that. Aristocratic men and women raised in the finest chateau of France, now sleeping in stalls and chicken coops. Believe me, in such conditions very little happens at Hartwell House that is not soon known by all." The spires of the estate's neo-Gothic chapel rose before them, delicate and sombre in the cold winter light. Provence stared at it for a moment, and then said, "What I'm trying to say is that even though she hugs the truth of it to herself, it is well known that my niece sees many physicians. Even after all these years of marriage, she still hopes for a child. God knows this family will never get any heirs from my loins. And nothing is more important to Marie-Thérèse than seeing the House of Bourbon restored to France for all eternity. Sebastian said, She's still relatively young. She is. She is. And there's no denying her mother took long enough to begin breeding. Sebastian kept his gaze on the soaring spires of the chapel before them. It was well known that Marie Antoinette's long delay in childbearing was due entirely to her husband the king's failure to consummate their marriage for 7 years. A number of rumours had circulated at the time, although most had eventually been laid to rest. But the same rumours continued to swirl around the Comte de Provence's own marriage. Some said his wife repulsed him, while others claimed he preferred his mistresses. And then there were those who said that Louis Stanislaus's interest in women had always been tepid and had waned completely in his later years. "Lovely, isn't it?" said the uncrowned king, his head tilting back, good-humoured pleasure suffusing his plump face as his gaze moved with obvious appreciation over the delicate tracery of the chapel's arched windows. But Sebastian was looking instead at the courtier Ambrose Lachapelle. The man was a bundle of contradictions. The tales of his courage as a volunteer in the Prince de Condé's army of counter-revolutionary exiles were legendary. A superb horseman, expert marksman, and skilled swordsman, he had once supported himself as a fencing master. But there were whispers of another side to the French nobleman. Some said the courtier was known to don women's clothing and cruise the darkened arcades of Covent Garden and the Exchange, where he was known as Serena Fox. And Sebastian found himself thinking about the mysterious unknown man and woman who had sought out Damien Pelletan on the night of his death, and about the bloody footprint left by a woman's shoe on a broken slat in the noisome passage where the physician had met his grisly end. Chapter 13. "Ain't ne'er seen nothing like them stables," said Tom, his voice hollow with disgust. "They only got 2 riding horses in there. 2! One of them is reserved special for the princess. Half the stalls have been turned into rooms and have people living in them. There was some old woman kept trying to sell me a straw hat she'd made, all the while claiming she was the Comtesse of something or another." "She probably was," said Sebastian, turning his tired team toward the nearby village of Stoke Mandeville, where he intended to make his next change. "Queer lot, if you ask me, even for foreigners. Most of them stable boys is French, too. I never seen such a close-mouthed set. Couldn't get no one to give me the time of day." "Unfortunate, but probably predictable," said Sebastian. He couldn't begin to understand how Marie-Thérèse's consultation with Dr. Damien Pelletan might possibly have anything to do with the physician's death. But neither could he get past the haunting coincidence that Pelletan's murder had fallen on the anniversary of the execution of the last crowned king of France. Tom said, "I thought this Marie-Thérèse is supposed to be a princess." "She is, the only surviving child of Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI of France." "So why is she called a duchess?" "Because she's married to a duke, although at the moment he's off with Wellington in Spain." "He's a duke, even though he's the son of a count? And his dart is a count, but also a prince? The son of a king?" "I know it's rather confusing, but that's the way the French do it. They aren't quite as tidy about titles and ranks as the English." "Makes no sense if you ask me," said Tom. "No wonder they can't even talk English proper like." The near leader stumbled, and Sebastian steadied his horses. He could see the mossy grey roof of the medieval church of Stoke Mandeville soaring above the treetops in the distance. The road was narrow here, a copse of beech undergrown with hazel closing in around them as he nursed the tired team up the slope. And he felt it again, a sensation of being watched that came on suddenly and intensely. He swept around a sharp bend to find the roadway blocked by a fallen limb. He reined in hard, the team of greys coming to a snorting standstill. Tom was about to jump down and run to their heads when Sebastian said in a low voice, "Don't." A man stepped from behind a thick stand of brush. He wore greasy canvas trousers and a threadbare brown corduroy coat, and had an ugly horse pistol thrust into his waistband. His gaunt face was unshaven, his accent that of the streets of London, as he said, "Having a spot of trouble there, your lordship." He reached up to grasp the leader's reins above their bits. "Here, let me help." Rather than being calmed by his presence, the greys whinnied and tossed their heads, nostrils flaring. Sebastian's hand tightened on his whip. "Stand back. Now, is that any way to respond to my friend's most generous offer of assistance?" asked a second man, this one mounted astride a showy chestnut that he nudged forward until he came to a halt some 5 or 6 feet from the curricle. He held a fine dueling pistol in his left hand. The gleaming wooden grip of its mate showed at his waist. Unlike his companion, this man wore buckskin breeches and an elegant riding coat, and his accent was pure Oxbridge. He had a rough wool scarf wrapped around the lower part of his face, so that all Sebastian could see was his dark eyes, their lashes as thick and long as a young girl's. For a moment his gaze met Sebastian's. Then the horseman blinked and extended the muzzle of his pistol towards Sebastian's face. "Run!" Sebastian shouted at Tom. Surging to his feet, he sent the lash of his whip snaking out to flick the chestnut on its flanks. The horse shied badly, its rider lurching in the saddle, the pistol exploding harmlessly into the treetops. "You bastard!" swore the horseman, dragging his mount back around as he reached for the second pistol. This time Sebastian's lash struck the chestnut's withers. The horse reared up just as its rider squeezed the trigger. The shot sent Sebastian's beaver hat tumbling end over end into the lane. "Bloody hell!" Sebastian swore, and jerked his own small double-barreled flintlock from his coat pocket. The horseman's eyes widened above the scarf, his hands tightening on his reins as he kicked the chestnut into a plunging gallop that carried him down the hill and around the bend, chevrons of mud flying up from the frenzied horse's hooves. With an ugly snarl, the brown-coated ruffian stepped back from Sebastian's team and pulled the horse pistol from his waistband. Sebastian thumbed back the hammer on his flintlock and shot him right between the eyes. The man turned a slow, ungainly pirouette, then fell hard. "Caw," whispered Tom, creeping from behind a nearby clump of hazel to stare down at the man's sprawled, still form. "Is he dead?" "I told you to run," said Sebastian as the tiger leapt to calm the now frantic, plunging horses. "You all right?" "Aye," said Tom, whispering soothing words that the greys seemed to understand. "Who you reckon that lot were?" "I don't know." Sebastian jumped down from the curricle's high seat to drag both the dead assailant and the downed limb from the roadway. He hesitated a moment, then yanked off the dead man's coat and threw it over his face, in case someone with delicate sensibilities should happen to drive past before he made it back with the proper authorities. But whoever sent them obviously wants me dead. Chapter 14. That afternoon, Hero went to visit her mother, Annabel, Lady Jarvis. Her affection for her mother ran deep, although the two women were little alike. Whereas Hero was tall, dark-haired, and determinedly frank in her manner, Annabel had in her youth been pretty and petite, with soft golden curls and melting blue eyes, and a sweetly charming smile. Hero had a dim memory of that woman, vivacious and loving, and far more intelligent than she ever allowed anyone, least of all her husband, to suspect. But an endless succession of miscarriages and stillbirths had gradually drained her energy and sapped her confidence and joy. And then, one dreadful night, her last brutal labour had ended with another dead child, and Annabel had suffered an apoplectic fit that left her weak in both mind and body. Yet, even with her nerves shattered, and her memory and reason a shadow of what they'd once been, Annabel still somehow managed to hold her own in the glittering, often cutthroat world of the haute tonne. And Hero knew she grasped far more about her husband's clandestine affairs than Jarvis had ever realized. The two women settled down for a cup of hot chocolate before a roaring fire in Annabel's dressing room, and chatted for a time about the latest cut of sleeves and the newest rosewater tonic. Then Hero looked over at her mother and said, "I hear there's a French peace delegation in town." Annabel's soft blue eyes clouded with wariness as she groped for her chocolate cup. "Where did you hear that, darling?" Hero gave her mother a good-natured smile. "From Devlin? Oh dear, I fear Jarvis will not be happy to learn that he knows." "Devlin already confronted him about it. He denied it, of course." "Yes, it's all very secretive." Not for the first time, Hero found herself wondering if her mother listened at keyholes, or if Jarvis was so convinced of his wife's idiocy that he no longer took care what he said around her. "And it's still quite preliminary as well," Annabel said. "At least, that's what I heard your father saying to someone the other night." "Yet it's encouraging that the delegation is here at all." "It is, yes. It seems difficult these days to remember a time when we were not at war with the French." Hero said, "But surely the British and French positions are quite far apart. I mean, I can't believe Napoleon will agree to abdicate." "Oh, no. He's definitely not the type to slip quietly off the world stage now, is he?" "Would Britain agree to a peace that left Bonaparte as Emperor of France?" "Well, some would be willing to see it happen." "But not others." The words, although unsaid, hung in the air. Hero fiddled with her cup. "I would imagine the British position is somewhat conflicted, given the French royal family's presence here as the Prince Regent's personal guests. Obviously, Prenny would like to see the Bourbons restored to France, both because he feels for their situation as a fellow royal, and because deposed kings, by their very existence, tend to undermine the legitimacy of every royal still stubbornly clinging to his own crown. And yet, which is more of a threat to the English monarchy? The survival of Napoleon's empire, or the continuation of a long, expensive war that has lost the support of England's hungry people and threatens to bankrupt the state?" "Well, from what I understand, Prenny is certainly most vocal in his determination to see the Bourbons restored to the throne of France." "And Papa?" An unexpectedly wise smile curled her mother's lips. "Must you ask? As far as your father is concerned, a compromise now would be folly. He insists that we shall soon see Napoleon driven from Paris by force of arms and a full restoration of the old ways." "Yet Wellington is still many miles from France, let alone Paris." "He is, yes. And I'm not convinced it would be either easy or wise to reimpose the old ways on a people who have been rid of them for nearly 25 years. The French have overthrown the Bourbons once, which means they'll know they could do it again, should they be so inclined. Next time, they might be shrewd enough not to set up an emperor in their king's place. And then we would once again have a Republican government right across the Channel, as opposed to far across the Atlantic, inspiring all sorts of dangerous urgings amongst the downtrodden masses." Annabel's hand fluttered up to press against her lips. "Good heavens, Hero, don't let your father hear you talk like that. He'll take you for a radical." "But I am a radical," said Hero, and laughed softly at the look of horror on her mother's face. She sipped her chocolate in silence for a moment, then said, "So, if Jarvis is convinced Napoleon can be defeated by force of arms, Why entertain this peace delegation at all? From what I gather, the Prime Minister and certain members of the Cabinet are more interested in the peace proposals than your father would like. Ah. Hero set aside her empty cup. In that case, I should think the delegation's presence in London is causing a few nervous spasms out at Hartwell House. I don't believe the Bourbons have been told of the delegation, although of course that doesn't mean they're necessarily ignorant of its presence. Lady Jarvis set aside her own cup and reached to take her daughter's hand. Now, enough of this boring nonsense. I want to hear how you are feeling. I'm fine, Mamma, although I swear I'm getting big enough to be carrying an elephant. She regretted the words as soon as she saw the look of anxiety flit across her mother's face. I'll be fine, Mamma. I can't help but worry. You are my daughter. Hero tightened her hold on her mother's hand. Mamma. I'm a good foot taller than you and quite sturdily built. I'll be fine. When do you see Richard Croft again? Hero pulled a face. Tomorrow. Annabel's forehead puckered with new concern. I know you don't care for the man, dear, but there's no denying he's the best accoucheur in Britain. Why, they say that the Regent has already secured Croft's promise that when Charlotte marries and is with child, he'll manage her confinement. Pity poor Princess Charlotte. Hero! Mamma! Hero laughed again and leaned forward to kiss her mother's cheek. I swear you are worse than Devlin. I'm not only as big as an elephant, but as healthy as one too. You must stop worrying. Annabel tilted her head as she searched Hero's face. Are you happy, darling? Yes, very. Annabel patted her hand. I'm so glad for you. But the troubled frown remained. Chapter 15. And you simply left the body there, in the wood? Asked Sir Henry Lovejoy, his voice squeaky with shock. The two men were walking down Bow Street toward the Brown Bear, an ancient tavern that served as a kind of extension of the legendary public office across the street. Sebastian glanced over at him. What would you have had me do? Drive into Stoke Mandeville with a dead man propped up on the curricle seat beside me? Sir Henry's eyes widened. Good gracious, no. I must admit I hadn't thought of that. Sebastian turned his laugh into a credible cough. I did alert the village magistrate. Unfortunately, during the time it took old Squire John to round up a couple of constables and a wagon in order to return with me to the scene, someone spirited away the corpse. I fear the worthy squire is more than half convinced I made the whole thing up. For your own amusement? Something like that. It had also made Sebastian damned late returning to London. He'd rushed back to Brook Street in an agony of apprehension and guilt, only to be told that Hero was spending the afternoon with her mother. I suppose it could have been highwaymen, said Sir Henry. Times are hard. Sebastian shook his head. Aylesbury Vale isn't exactly Finchley Common. Apart from which, the gentleman on the chestnut did not exactly look like he was in severe financial straits. The magistrate pursed his lips as he stared out over the crush of carts and wagons filling the narrow street. The alternative possibility that this attack is related to your involvement in the murder of Damien Pelletan is troubling, most troubling. He glanced over at Sebastian. How many people knew you were planning to drive out to Hartwell House today? My entire household, for starters. But I suspect it's more likely I was overheard making arrangements to hire a team from the livery stables in Boyle Street. Sir Henry frowned. You think someone followed you? Yes. Dear me. I'll have one of the lads pop around there and see if anyone came in after you asking questions."
Sebastian shook his head. "It might be better if I sent Tom. I wouldn't want you to fall afoul of the chief magistrate."
Sir Henry gave him a rare, tight smile. "My lads can be very discreet when so inclined." He cleared his throat. "They made some inquiries into the gentleman staying at the Gifford Arms, by the way." "Oh?" "The clerk is a man by the name of Camille Bonduron. He's trained in the law and is said to be a rather taciturn man, who generally keeps to himself. He takes a constitutional every morning, up and down the Mall, at precisely 10 o'clock.
"And the colonel?"
"Colonel André Fouché. He was with Napoleon in Russia."
"Now that's interesting."
I thought so as well. I'm told he's fond of the Sultan's Rest, a coffee-house near the Armory."
The magistrate started to turn into the Brown Bear, then paused to look back and say,
"Did you know Peloton's funeral has been scheduled for this evening?"
"So soon? Where?"
"The French Chapel near Portman Square. At 7 o'clock.
Sebastian found the chapel in Little George Street, hung with black crape, and lit with branches of flaring beeswax candles. A row of high plain windows showed black against the night sky, and a lingering memory of old incense mingled with the scents of hot wax and cold dank stone. The small Catholic church had been established late in the previous century by non-juring priests fleeing the French Revolution. Its interior was plain to the point of being primitive, with only the Stations of the Cross and a scattering of wall-mounted tombs relieving the starkness. A prominently placed high-backed chair served as the throne of the uncrowned King of France, whenever he chose to honour the congregation with his presence. If Damien Peloton had indeed come to London as part of a delegation sent by Napoleon, as Hero's conversation with her mother that afternoon certainly suggested, then the choice of this chapel as the site of his funeral struck Sebastian as mildly ironic. But then it would never do to forget that Napoleon had managed to have himself crowned emperor by Pope Pius VII. Closing the door quietly behind him, Sebastian paused to glance down the short central aisle to where a dark oaken casket, draped in blue velvet, stood open before the altar. He didn't approach the coffin, but slipped sideways to stand against the rear wall, deep in the shadows thrown by the rickety wooden west gallery overhead. A heavy, oppressive silence filled the church, punctuated by an occasional cough. There were only 3 mourners, scattered widely across the short rows of pews separated by a central aisle. He recognized Armand Vaudreuil in the second row. The colonel, André Fouché, had taken a seat 3 rows back and far off to one side. As Sebastian watched, Fouché slipped his watch from his pocket and frowned down at the time. The third man, thin and bony-faced, with a red nose and straight black hair, occupied the last row. Sebastian didn't recognize him, but he had his head bent over a book, his shoulders hunched against the cold. This, surely, was the clerk Camille Bonduron. The minutes ticked past. Sebastian crossed his arms at his chest and ignored the damp chill that seeped up through the soles of his boots as he watched the surviving members of the French delegation. 3 men who knew one another and lived together, attending the funeral of one of their own, yet all ignoring one another. Mitt Peebles obviously knew what he was talking about when he said they didn't like one another much. The sound of the door opening drew Sebastian's attention to the entrance. A slim, chestnut-haired, flamboyantly dressed man entered, and paused just inside the door to remove his hat and dip his fingers in the holy water to make an absent-minded sign of the cross. Sebastian stared at him. It was Ambrose Lachapelle. "What the devil is he doing here?" thought Sebastian. Intrigued,
Sebastian watched the courtier slide into the pew opposite the clerk, slip to his knees, make the sign of the cross again, and bow his head in prayer. It occurred to Sebastian, watching him, that La Chapelle was the only man in the church praying. The church bells of the city had long ago struck 7. Colonel Fouché frowned and once again checked his watch. Sebastian could hear whispers and a flutter of movement from the sacristy, suggesting that the priest was finally preparing to begin his solemn procession. Then the street door opened again with a noisy jerk, and another man entered the chapel. Of average height and build, he was some 35 years of age, with bored grey eyes and thick honey-coloured hair worn fashionably disarranged. His exquisitely cut coat came from one of London's best tailors, but his buckskin breeches were more suited to a ride in the park than to a funeral, and rather than a cravat, he wore a neckcloth knotted rakishly at his throat. He neither removed his high-crowned beaver hat nor bowed his head, but strode swiftly down the centre aisle to draw up abruptly at the head of the open coffin. Sebastian watched him with interest. The newcomer's name was Lord Peter Radcliffe. He was the younger son of the late Duke of Linford, and brother to the current Duke. To Sebastian's knowledge, he had no interest in either government or commerce, but devoted himself to a hedonistic lifestyle that revolved largely around the opera, the turf, and the kind of ruinous gaming hells popularized by the Prince Regent and his set. So, why was he here? He stood beside the coffin for perhaps a half a minute, his shoulders stiff, the fingers of his hands alternately opening and closing into fists at his sides as he stared at the dead man's pallid face. Then he turned and left the church just as the door from the sacristy opened. A bent, wizened priest, dressed in a white alb and vested in a black stole embroidered with gold crosses, tottered into the nave, accompanied by 2 altar boys and a waft of incense. With muted coughs and throat clearings, the assembled mourners rose to their feet. Moving quietly, Sebastian slipped out the main entrance, but by the time he reached the footpath, Radcliffe's barouche was already bowling away up George Street, its lanterns swinging wildly with the sway of the well-sprung carriage. Sebastian was still staring thoughtfully after it when Armand Vaudreuil walked out of the chapel behind him. Chapter 16. Armand Vaudreuil drew up in the shadow of the chapel's modest portico. He was built small and rotund, with fat fingers and a short neck swathed in a voluminous white cravat. He had full cheeks, and the kind of eyes that practically disappeared into his round pink face when he smiled, so that the effect was one of cordial good cheer. It was an effect that Sebastian knew, even without being told, was deceptive. One did not achieve Vaudreuil's position without a ruthless opportunism, and the kind of brutal self-interest that gave no quarter and took no prisoners. "I know who you are," he said. "You're that Earl's son, the one with a peculiar obsession with murder and justice. Devlin, isn't it? I saw you standing at the back of the church." Sebastian turned to face him. "Decided not to stay for the funeral mass." The Frenchman gave a soft laugh. "I was trained for the priesthood as a boy. Needless to say, the choice of a vocation was not mine. In my family, 2nd sons joined the army and 3rd sons became priests. If for no other reason, I shall forever be grateful to the Revolution for sparing me a life of hypocrisy and unutterable ennui. Believe me, Damiens Pelletan would have known better than to expect me to sit through his funeral mass." "You knew Pelletan well?" "He was my personal physician. I have a troublesome heart, you see." "That doesn't exactly answer my question." "No?" Vaudreuil slowly descended the last step, an odd, tight smile crinkling the flesh beside his eyes as he drew up on the footpath. "Be wise, my lord, and leave well enough alone. Believe me, it is better for all concerned if Damiens Pelletan is thought to have been killed by footpads." Better for you, for me, or for Damien Pelletan? Vaudreuil's smile widened. For everyone? Someone tried to kill me today on the road from Hartwell House. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Vaudreuil laughed out loud with what sounded like genuine amusement. They are a murderous lot, the Bourbons. And you have no idea what you are meddling in? Not exactly, agreed Sebastian, but I have a very fertile imagination, plus a healthy appreciation for what the loss of 500,000 men in 6 months can do to popular perception of an upstart leader's legitimacy. The Frenchman was no longer smiling. Sebastian said, Given that a member of your delegation has been— Delegation? What nonsense is this? Has been murdered. One might expect you to cooperate with any attempt to find his killer. Yet you appear to have no interest. Why is that? But we are cooperating with Bow Street, and Bow Street assures us that Pelletan was killed by footpads. Why try to make his death out to be something more than it was? Damien Pelletan was not killed by footpads, and you know it. So certain, my lord. What kind of footpad steals a man's heart and leaves his purse? Vaudreuil's face went utterly slack with what looked very much like horror. What did you say? You heard me. Sebastian studied the other man's pale, suddenly haggard features. Would you have me believe you didn't know? The Frenchman swiped a shaky hand across his mouth. No, I was not told the details. I mean, I saw the body at that dreadful surgery near the tower. I knew the chest was— But the heart— taken? He swallowed hard. You are certain? You find the knowledge unsettling? Why? Good God, who would not find it unsettling? I mean, to steal a man's heart. It is barbaric. It is the work of madness. What a violent, dangerous place this London of yours is. True. Yet it is considerably more salubrious than Paris in, say, 1793, wouldn't you agree? Vaudreuil's jaw hardened. Those dark days are 20 years in our past. 20 years is not so long ago. The wind gusted up, scuttling a loose playbill down the street and bringing them the voice of the priest with sudden, unexpected clarity. Ambulabo coram domino, in regione vivorum. Sebastian said, Who would want to put an end to the possibility of peace talks between Napoleon Bonaparte and the British government? I never said very well. In honor of your exquisite sensitivity to the finer points of language, I'll rephrase the question. If preliminary peace talks were to be held between Paris and London, who would have an interest in seeing them brought to an untimely end? Truly, monsieur, the list is endless. In my experience, those for whom war is lucrative are rarely satiated. For them, war is opportunity, not hardship or sorrow. After all, it is rarely their sons who lie in unmarked graves on foreign soil. Sebastian studied the fat, successful bureaucrat before him. Vaudreuil himself had obviously profited handsomely from the revolution and the endless wars that followed it. But all Sebastian said was, Do you have anyone in particular in mind? The Frenchman gave a tight-lipped smile. Surely you know those in England who profit from war better than I, yes? And the French? Vaudreuil shook his head. In France, even those who once grew rich off the empire know that the efforts of the last 2 decades are no longer sustainable. I suspect you'll find that those French most fervently opposed to the idea of peace between England and Napoleon are to be found on this side of the Channel, not the other. You mean the Royalists? The émigrés, the Royalists, the Bourbons. There are tens of thousands of my former compatriots here. Most dream of someday returning to France, and of revenge. Do the Bourbons know of your presence here in London? Officially? No. But there are few involved in this conflict who do not have their own spies. Any chance the Comte de Provence could be behind Pelleton's death? Provence? Vondroy crinkled his nose in a way that turned down the corners of his mouth. The soi-disant Louis XVIII is ill, childless, and old before his time. In my opinion, the one who bears watching is the younger brother, the Comte d'Artois. Artois and his niece, the Duchesse d'Angoulême. It would be a mistake to dismiss Marie-Thérèse as half-mad. She is, after all, Marie-Antoinette's daughter. I have heard Napoleon himself say that Marie-Thérèse is the only real man in her family. He fears her. I would not go so far to say he fears her. But he watches her. Yes, he definitely watches her. Vondroy touched his hand to his hat and inclined his head. Monsieur. He was turning away when Sebastian asked, "Are you by chance acquainted with Lord Peter Radcliffe?" The Frenchman pivoted slowly to face him again. I knew the man well enough to have recognized him, if that's what you mean. An unexpected gleam of amusement lit Vondroy's small dark eyes. I assume you noticed that he, likewise, did not stay for Pelleton's funeral mass? Why would a son of the Duke of Linford attend the funeral of a French physician who arrived in London only 3 weeks ago? I believe Radcliffe is married to a young French woman, someone Pelleton knew in Paris, many years ago. Sebastian was familiar with the young Lady Peter, for her beauty was legendary. She had come to England 9 years before, when her father, a highly respected general in the Grande Armée, had a falling out with Napoleon that forced the family to flee France. But she had not arrived in London penniless, for the general had managed to accumulate a small fortune that he kept safely abroad, and he had settled nearly half of his wealth on his beautiful daughter. An unpleasant gleam shone in Vondroy's eyes. Perhaps you seek too complicated a motive for this murder, monsieur. Perhaps what we are dealing with is a simple, if somewhat ghoulish, affaire de cœur. It would explain much, yes? Was Pelleton in love with Lady Peter? Once, perhaps, who knows? Damiens Pelleton was my physician, not my friend or confidant. Vondroy bowed again. And now you really must excuse me, my lord. Sebastian watched him stroll away toward Portman Square, the cold wind flapping the tails of his black coat, while from inside the church came a low, mournful chant. Vie Jesu Domine, dona eis requiem. Amen. Chapter 17. Lord Peter Radcliffe was one of those men who wore the dignity of his exalted birth with an easy grace and a good-natured smile. Born into a life of rare wealth and privilege, he was a duke's second son, which meant that all the responsibility for maintaining the family's vast estates and managing their considerable investments fell not to him, but to his elder brother. To Lord Peter came a handsome allowance and the freedom to spend his days as he saw fit, lounging in the famous bow window at White's, hunting in Melton Mowbray, and surrounding himself with a circle of bon vivants known for their exquisite manners, their flawless taste, and their willingness to bet on almost anything. Like his friends Beau Brummel and Lord Alvanley, he'd once enjoyed a brief career in a fashionable London regiment, but he soon sold out to devote himself to the less demanding activities of a man about town. His marriage 8 years before to one of the most beautiful women in London had little altered his way of life, which was why, rather than look for Lord Peter at his comfortable house in Half Moon Street, Sebastian spent the evening moving from one gentleman's haunts to the next, from White's in St. James's Street to Wattier's in Piccadilly, and then on to Limmer's, all without success. He was sipping a fine French cognac in a fashionable coffee-house near Conduit Street when Lord Peter entered the room and walked straight up to him. "Why the devil are you looking for me?" he demanded, the fingers of one hand tapping against his hard thigh. Sebastian leaned back in his seat. "I think you know." Radcliffe hesitated a moment, then ordered a brandy, pulled out the chair opposite, and sat. "I saw you at the French chapel." Sebastian brought his cognac to his lips and regarded the Duke's son over the glass's rim. "You were friends with Damiens Peloton?" "Me? No." Radcliffe propped one exquisitely polished boot on the other knee. The posture was casual, relaxed. He had a reputation amongst his friends for easy-going charm and boundless generosity, although Sebastian knew there were those who had seen another side of him, a side that could be brusque and condescending and freezingly arrogant. "I went for the sake of my wife. He was a friend of hers when she was a child in Paris." "But did you know him?" "I met him once or twice." He gave Sebastian a hooded sideways glance. "To be frank, I don't quite understand why you've involved yourself in this. The papers are saying he was killed by footpads in St. Catherine's." "He was killed in St. Catherine's, yes, but footpads had nothing to do with it." Radcliffe was silent for a moment, his gaze dropping to the glass he twirled back and forth between his hands. He was still an attractive man, with a wide, winning smile, but in repose one could see that the years of dissipation were beginning to leave their marks in telltale ways, coarsening the texture of his flesh and loosening the muscle tone of his still trim frame. Sebastian said, "What can you tell me about him? You say your wife knew him in Paris." Radcliffe seemed to rouse himself from his brown study. "She did, yes. They grew up next door to each other on the Île de la Cité. His father is still a prominent physician at the Hôtel Dieu or someplace." "Oh?" Radcliffe frowned. "I seem to recall hearing about a dust-up of some sort or another involving the father, but it was years ago. Something to do with the royal family during the Terror. I couldn't tell you exactly what." "What do you know of Damiens Peloton's politics?" "Politics?" Radcliffe shook his head. "I had the impression Peloton had no interest in politics." His passion was medicine. It struck Sebastian as more than a little strange that someone with no interest in politics would join a peace delegation, even if simply in the capacity of a physician. But all he said was, "When was the last time you saw him?" Radcliffe took a slow, deliberate sip of his brandy, as if carefully considering his response. "I don't recall precisely. A week ago, perhaps? Maybe more." "Not last Thursday night?" asked Sebastian, thinking of the unidentified man and woman who had visited Peloton at the Gifford Arms the night of his death. Radcliffe froze with his glass suspended just above the table. All traces of easy-going bonhomie had vanished, leaving him looking mulish and vaguely sulky. "No, not Thursday night. I spent Thursday night at home with my wife." "All night?" "Yes, damn you." Sebastian thrust out his legs to cross his boots at the ankles. "You say you attended Peloton's funeral for the sake of your wife. Is she distressed by his death?" "Of course she is. What do you expect? They were old friends." "Yet, having put in an appearance at her childhood's friend's funeral, you didn't feel the need to return home and comfort her?" Angry colour mottled Radcliffe's cheeks. "What the bloody hell do you mean to imply by that?" "Have you by any chance heard precisely how Damiens Peloton was killed?" A faint wariness crept over the other man's features. "I assumed he was bludgeoned to death. That's what footpads normally do, is it not?" Actually, he was stabbed in the back with a dagger. Then the killer, or killers, dragged his body into a noisome passage and cut out his heart. Something flared in the other man's eyes, something quickly hidden by his lowered lids. Sebastian watched him closely. Do you have any idea why someone would want to do that? It seems rather symbolic, don't you think? To rip a man's heart from his chest? For one fierce moment, Radcliffe's gaze met his. Then he slammed his unfinished brandy on the table and thrust up to stride quickly from the coffee-house, the amber liquid in the glass sloshing violently back and forth, until at last it stilled. Half an hour later, Sebastian arrived at Tower Hill to find Paul Gibson seated on the wooden chair at the injured woman's bedside, his elbows propped on his splayed knees, his chin in his hands. A basin with a cloth stood on a nearby table, its surface splashed dark with spilled water. He raised his head at Sebastian's entrance, but didn't stand. In the bed, the woman lay terribly still, her eyes closed. Sweat glistened on her white forehead and drenched the flame-red hair dark at the temples. "How is she?" Sebastian asked quietly. Gibson shook his head and let out a long, strained breath. "She's delirious. I'm afraid her fever is climbing. From the chill she took the night of the murder, or from her injury? There's no way to tell." He raked the dishevelled hair from his face, then linked his fingers behind his neck to arch his back in a stretch. "I asked one of my colleagues at St. Bartholomew's, Dr. Lothan, to stop by and have a look at her. He wanted to blister her, bleed her, and purge her, the usual panoply of heroic medicine." "Did you let him?" "No. I swear I've seen more men killed by bloodletting and purging than by cannon and musket balls combined. I thanked him for his advice and showed him out. But ever since I've been sitting here wondering if I shouldn't at least have let him try. I mean, I'm just a simple surgeon. I can set your broken arm or cut off your mangled leg, and if you're game, I might even undertake to cut out your kidney stones. But I'm no physician. I never went to Oxford or Cambridge. My Latin is abysmal, my Greek non-existent, and the one time I tried to read Galen, I gave it up after a few pages. Who am I to question a medical tradition that's endured for more than 2,000 years? I don't think you give yourself enough credit. You know more about the human body than any physician I've ever met." Gibson gave a ragged laugh. "If you're dead." Reaching out, he squeezed the cloth over the basin and began again to bathe the woman's face. "Has she said anything more?" Sebastian asked, going to stand at the foot of the bed. Gibson had reduced the size of the bandage on the woman's head so that Sebastian had his first good look at her. She was an attractive woman in her late 20s or early 30s, with milky white skin faintly dusted with cinnamon across her high-bridged nose. Her eyes were closed, but Sebastian knew what colour they would be if they were open. A deep, loamy brown. "Nothing coherent," said Gibson. But then he must have sensed the subtle shift in Sebastian's posture, or perhaps a sudden charge in the air, because he turned to look at Sebastian. "What is it?" Sebastian kept his gaze on the woman. "I've met her before." "You have? Where?" "Portugal. Her name was Alexandre Beauclerc then. The last time I saw her, she swore that if our paths ever crossed again, she would kill me." Chapter 18. The inrushing tide brought with it all the familiar evocative sense of the distant sea, and a cold briny mist that wet Sebastian's cheeks, and beaded like unshed tears on the ends of his lashes. He stood on the ragged, unfinished arc of the new stone bridge that would someday span the Thames.
The river was a foam-flecked, turgid rush far below, the city quieting and slowly sinking into darkness around him. He found himself unconsciously rubbing his wrists, where the old scars still showed as white lines against his skin. He'd thought, in his confident naivete, that he was somehow coming to terms with those events of 3 years ago. But he realized now that he'd simply fallen victim to a comfortable illusion wrought by the passage of time, and the joy an unexpected, enduring love could bring. He tried to focus on the swirling black waters of the river below, but what he saw instead were soul-destroying images from a different time, a different place. And as he turned toward shore, he could have sworn he caught the distant echo of children's laughter and the faint scent of orange blossoms overlain by the heavy stench of old blood. Some hours later, Hero paused in the doorway to the darkened library. The soft light from the street lamp fell through the open curtains to show her the man who stood with his back to the room, his gaze on the empty street beyond. She could feel the intensity of the tension thrumming through him, see it in every line of his tall, lean body. She'd moved quietly, but of course he heard her. Even after 6 months of living with this man, she still found the acuity of his senses disconcerting. He turned his head to look at her over his shoulder, and a humming silence stretched out between them. She said, "I've watched you work to solve murders before. I know how personally you take what you do, how deeply troubled you can become. But there's something more going on here, isn't there, Devlin?" He shifted his gaze once again to the window so that she could see only his profile. He said, "I saw someone tonight who reminded me of an incident I've spent the last 3 years trying to forget." "Someone you knew in the peninsula?" "Yes, the injured woman in Gibson's surgery." She went to him then, sliding her arms around his waist and laying her cheek against his strong, taut back. He brought his hands up to lay them over hers at his waist and tipped back his head until it rested against hers. But he didn't say anything, and neither did she. She knew something had happened to him during the war, something that had shattered the already frayed remnants of his youthful idealism, and made a mockery of so much that Englishmen of his station traditionally held dear. It had driven him to resign his commission, and plunged him into a downward spiral that came perilously close to destroying him. But that was all she knew, and she feared what might happen if the toxic events swirling around Damien Pelleton's murder forced him to confront the unresolved demons of his past. Sunday, 24th of January. The next morning, Sebastian was easing his coat up over his shoulders when his valet said, "I believe I've discovered the individual in whom you expressed an interest." Sebastian straightened his cuffs. "Oh?" "His name is Samson Bullock, and he's a cabinet maker. He lives over his workshop on Tichborne Street, not far from Piccadilly. I took the liberty of making a few inquiries." Sebastian glanced over at him. "Learn anything interesting?" "It seems Mr. Bullock is not what you might call well-liked in the area." "I take it I am to infer that that is an understatement." "Indeed. From the sound of things, he's a quarrelsome brute with a nasty temper. Most of his neighbours were reluctant even to speak of him. He has a reputation for being rather vindictive, lethally so." "Hear anything about his brother?" "Only that the two were much alike, both big, brawny, and foul-tempered. The brother's name was Abel." "Samson and Abel. How very biblical." "Did you discover what happened to the brother?" "I did, my lord. He died 2 weeks ago." "Under Alexandre Sauvage's care?" "No, my lord. He died of jail fever in Newgate." A curving sweep of pubs, small shops, and tradesmen's establishments, Tichborne Street lay to the south of Golden Square, just off Piccadilly. It was a middling area,
neither fashionable nor wretched. Sebastian found Bullock's shop near the corner. The shutters were up, yet the door opened to his touch, which was unexpected, given that it was early Sunday morning. He entered a shadowy, cavernous space, smelling pleasantly of freshly cut wood, linseed oil, and turpentine. An inquiry, addressed to a half-starved, frightened-looking apprentice sweeping up a scattering of sawdust, led Sebastian to a back room, where a massive man with a head of thick, curly black hair and a pronounced jaw was planing a long board. He had his head bent, his shoulders hunched, his arms moving in long, rhythmic sweeps. "Samson Bullock?" asked Sebastian, pausing on the far side of the board. The cabinet-maker straightened slowly. He stood half a head taller than Sebastian, and must have weighed nearly 20 stone, with a heavily muscled body and broad, solid chest. He was one of those men whose neck was so thick that it appeared even wider than his head. His dark eyes were unnaturally small and set close over a small nose, so that when one looked at him, the overall impression was of black hair, bulging muscles, and a red, wheel-like scar that disfigured one cheek. His eyes narrowed with obvious suspicion as he took in Sebastian's inimitably tailored dark blue coat, the snowy crispness of his cravat, the suppleness of his doe-skin breeches. Then he returned to his work, the curls of wood shavings blooming beneath the plane. "We're closed. It's the Lord's Day, didn't you know?" "It looks to me like you're working." "What you want from me? Your kind don't buy furniture from the likes of me." "I understand you know Alexandre Sauvage." Bullock tossed aside his plane. "That's what you're here for, is it? I heard what happened to her and that French doctor." He raised one hand to point a meaty finger at Sebastian. "Think you're going to lay the blame for that one on me, do you? Well, I ain't been near St. Catherine's. Nowhere near it." "So where were you last Thursday night?" "I was home in me bed, asleep. Where else would a good, God-fearing working man be on a Thursday night?" Sebastian studied the cabinet-maker's mulish set features and watched his eyes slide away. Sebastian said, "I understand you had a dispute of sorts with Madame Sauvage." "Dispute? That's what you want to call it." "The bloody bitch killed me brother." "How? What do you mean, how? Are you suggesting she poisoned him?" "I ain't never said no such thing." "It's my understanding he died of jail fever in Newgate." "Was she treating him?" "Of course she weren't physicking him. It were because of that interfering little strumpet that Abel was in Newgate in the first place." "Oh? What was he accused of having done?" Bullock's small eyes grew dark and hard. "I ain't got nothing to say to you," he muttered, and reached for his plane. Sebastian said, "You do realize you've been seen hanging around Golden Square, following her, threatening her?" Bullock thrust out his heavy jaw, the puckered flesh of his scar darkening from red to an angry purple. "I got nothing to hide. I ain't denying I spoke me mind to her, and why the hell shouldn't I? I ain't never threatened her, and anyone tells you I did is a bloody liar." "You didn't threaten to make her pay." "Who told you that? Her?" "No." Bullock curled his lip in a sneer. "Me? I think you got the wrong idea about the bitch. To hear people talk, she's some bloody angel of mercy or some such thing. She's no angel, not by a long shot. She's got a temper on her, that one. Why, I've heard her threaten to gut a man with a fish knife, I have, just because she didn't like the way he were looking at his own wife." Sebastian thought about the fiercely passionate woman he had known in Portugal, and had no difficulty imagining such a scene. "I can tell you plenty of things about that woman. I bet you don't know," Bullock was saying. "There's a fair number of frogs live about here, you see. I've heard 'em talking about her, how she was with Boney's army in Spain, and about how her lover was a French lieutenant. Not her lawful husband, mind you. Her lover." "I know about the peninsula," said Sebastian simply. Bullock grunted, the sound reverberating deeply in his massive chest. Sebastian let his gaze drift around the workshop with its carcasses of half-finished cabinets, its piles of lumber, its rows of tools kept well-oiled and carefully honed. "I'm still not exactly clear on the reason behind your animosity toward Madame Sauvage. I told you! It was because of her that me brother Abel was in Newgate." "What had he done?" "He didn't do a bleeding thing." "So what did she accuse him of doing?" "Why don't you ask her?" snarled Bullock. Then he turned pointedly back to his board, the muscles in his strong shoulders and arms bunching and flexing as he ran the plane over its surface again and again. Sebastian watched the curls of wood shavings scatter in fragrant drifts. If Alexandre Sauvage had been found with her head brutally beaten to a pulp, Bullock would have seemed the obvious suspect. But she was not the main target of Thursday's night attack, and there was nothing to tie this brutish cabinet-maker to Damien Pelletan. Sebastian should have been able to discount the possibility of the hulking tradesman's involvement out of hand, for he could think of no logical reason why Bullock would have allowed Alexandre Sauvage to live, only to vent his wrath on her unknown French companion instead. Yet Sebastian could not discount him. There was a rank odour of malevolence about the man, an ugly gleam in his small black eyes that Sebastian recognized, for he had seen it before. Men like Samson Bullock didn't simply exploit their extraordinary size and strength. They revelled in the fear it inspired in others, and they used that fear to bully and intimidate their way through life. And when the intimidation failed to achieve its intended result, or sometimes when they were simply feeling particularly mean, they killed. And they enjoyed it. Chapter 19. At 5 minutes after 10, Sebastian stood near the gates of the Carlton House Gardens and watched as the French clerk, Camille Boudon, strode purposefully up the mall, his arms swinging, his features wearing the blank expression of a man whose thoughts are far, far away. He wore a heavy drab greatcoat with a thick scarf knit of shockingly blue wool wrapped around his throat. His exhalations left little white puffs in the cold air that drifted away into nothing. Once, a long sweep of crushed shells, where the kings of England were fond of playing a French game called Pal-Maï, the moor lay to the north of St. James's Park. A broad gravel walkway planted with rows of lime and elm, it was mirrored on the far side of the park by what was known as Birdcage Walk. Due to its proximity to the Gifford Arms, Birdcage Walk would have seemed the more logical choice for a resident of the inn in search of exercise. But that walkway had a reputation that must have inspired Bondurant to avoid it. "Bracing day for a walk," said Sebastian, falling into step beside him. The Frenchman cast Sebastian a quick glance and kept walking. He was a tall, cadaverously thin man with greasy black hair and a raw-boned face. His eyes were nearly lashless and squinted, either from habit or in an effort to see Sebastian more clearly. "Do I know you?" he asked, his English guttural and heavily accented. "I was at Damien Pelletan's funeral. I do not recall seeing you." "Probably because you were reading," said Sebastian pleasantly. The clerk drew up and swung to face him. "What do you want from me?" "You do realize that Pelletan was murdered, don't you?" "Of course I realize it. What do you take me for? A fool?" "Do you know why he was killed?" "Because he was unwise enough to venture into a dangerous section of an unfamiliar city at night? Because he was French? Because someone took exception to the cut of his coat? How should I know? And I fail to see how it is any of your affair anyway." "Had he quarrelled with anyone recently?" "Pelletan? With whom would he quarrel?" The man had no opinions on anything of importance that I could discern. Try to engage him in a discussion of Rousseau or Montesquieu, and all he would do is laugh, and say that the philosophical speculations of dead men were of no interest to him. So what did interest him? The sick, especially the poor ones. Bondurant's face twisted with contempt. He could become quite maudlin. "You're not fond of philanthropy, I take it?" "No, I am not. The sooner the poor are allowed to die off, the better for society. Why encourage them to procreate?" "Kings and emperors need to get their soldiers from somewhere," said Sebastian. "True. The lower orders are at least good for cannon fodder." "Something the Emperor Napoleon seems to go through at an astonishing rate." Bondurant pursed his large mouth into a terse expression. "What has any of this to do with me?" "You know of no one who would want to kill Pelletan?" "I believe I already answered that question." He tightened his scarf around his neck. "Now you must excuse me. You have interrupted my constitutional." And he strode off, arms swinging, head down, as if battling a strong wind, or reading a book that was no longer there. Sebastian's next stop was the Sultan's Rest, a coffee-house on Dartmouth Street, popular with the military men of the area. He found the comfortable oak-panelled room thick with tobacco smoke, and filled with red-coated officers all talking and laughing at once. The French colonel, Fouché, sat by himself in one corner, inconspicuous in his dark coat and modest cravat. His head was bent over a newspaper opened on the table before him. A cup of coffee rested at his elbow. But Sebastian knew by a certain subtle alertness about his person that the Frenchman's attention was focused more on the conversations swirling around him than on the page before him. Working his way across the crowded room, Sebastian pulled out the chair opposite the colonel. "Mind if I have a seat?" The colonel looked up, his hazel eyes blinking several times. "Would it stop you if I did?" he asked, leaning back in his own chair as Sebastian sat down. The Frenchman was tall and well-built, although illness and injury had left him thin and his face sallow. Sebastian could see scattered strands of white in his sandy hair and thick moustache. Lines dug deep by weather and endured pain fanned the skin beside his eyes. Sebastian cast a significant glance around the crowded room. "Popular place?" "It is it not?" "I assume that's why you come here." A slow gleam of amusement warmed the other man's gaze. "I find I enjoy the company of military men, whatever their uniform." "I hear you were in Russia?" "Yes." "There aren't many who staggered out of that fiasco alive. With the exception of Napoleon himself, of course." "No." Sebastian rested his forearms on the tabletop and leaned into them. "Let's get over rough ground as quickly as possible, shall we? I know why Vaudreuil is here. What I don't know is why someone would stab Damien Pelletan in the back and cut out his heart. The most obvious reason would be to disrupt your mission. The mutilation of the corpse seems rather macabre, but it could be a subtle warning directed at Monsieur Vaudreuil, who, I understand, suffers from a heart condition." The colonel took a slow sip of his coffee and said nothing. "Then again," said Sebastian, "Pelletan could have been killed because he had in some way become a threat to the success of your mission." "Is that why you are here? Because you consider me a reasonable suspect?" "You don't think you should be?" Fouché eased one thumb and forefinger down over his flaring moustache. "If he had simply been killed, I could see that, yes. But the very flamboyance of his murder tends to work against such an argument, does it not?" "It does. Unless the killer were fueled by anger, or the kind of bloodlust one sometimes sees on the battlefield." Sebastian let his gaze drift around the noisy room. We've both known men who enjoy mutilating the bodies of their fallen enemies."
Again, the colonel sipped his coffee and remained silent.
Sebastian said, "There is, of course, a third possibility, that Pelletan was killed for personal reasons. It's unlikely, given that he was only in London for 3 weeks. But it is still an option."
The French colonel reached for his cup again, with a care that suggested his lingering injury might be to his right arm or shoulder.
"You know about the woman, I assume?"
Sebastian watched the other man's face, but Fouché was very good at giving nothing away.
"What woman? The wife of some duke, or perhaps it is the son of a duke?"
"You mean Lord Peter Radcliffe?"
"Yes, that is it. His wife is very beautiful. So you do know her?" "Yes."
The Frenchman drained his coffee and set it aside.
"The husbands of beautiful women are frequently subject to passionate fits of jealousy and possessiveness. If you seek a personal motive, that might be a good place to start, yes? Particularly given the removal of Pelletan's heart."
"Did you know that Pelletan was killed on the 20th anniversary of the execution of Louis XVI?
"No, I did not. You believe that to be significant?"
"Rather a coincidence, if it is not, wouldn't you agree?" The colonel wiped his moustache again and rose to his feet.
"Life is full of coincidences."
He started to turn. Sebastian stopped him by saying, "Why do you think Ambrose Lachapelle attended Pelletan's funeral mass?"
"Perhaps you should ask him," said the colonel.
Then he pushed his way through the laughing, jostling crowd, a tall, erect man with the bearing of a military officer, surrounded by his nation's enemies. Chapter 20. By the time Sebastian reached the Half-Moon Street townhouse of Lord and Lady Peter Radcliffe, thick white clouds were pressing down on the city, and he could smell a hint of snow in the frosty air. He didn't expect to find Radcliffe at home, and in that he wasn't disappointed. Lady Peter also was out, but a friendly conversation with a young kitchen maid, scrubbing the area steps, her hands red with cold, elicited the information that the mistress had taken her small brother and a friend to Green Park. Sebastian thanked the girl and turned his steps toward the park. He knew something of Lady Peter's story. She'd been born Julia Durand in the dying days of the Ancien Régime. Her father, the younger son of a minor Rhône Valley nobleman, had trained as an artillery officer at the prestigious École Militaire in Paris. When the people of Paris rose up and overthrew the Bourbons, Georges Durand did not flee France. Rather than join the forces of the counter-revolutionaries, he remained loyal to the land of his birth, eventually becoming a trusted general, first under the National Convention, then under the Directory. But General Durand never had much use for a certain cocky young Corsican named Napoleon Bonaparte. When Napoleon declared himself emperor in 1804, Georges Durand tried to stop him, and only narrowly escaped with his life. Fortunately, he'd had the forethought to send his wife and children out of the country first. And before he died, the old French general managed to marry his beautiful daughter Julia to the youngest son of an English duke. When Sebastian walked up to her, Lady Peter was seated on an iron bench near the lodge. She wore a thick, dusky pink pelisse and a close bonnet trimmed with a delicate bunch of velvet and silk flowers, and was smiling faintly as she watched her orphaned 8-year-old brother toss a ball to his friend. Then she saw Sebastian, and her smile faded. "No, don't run away," he said, as she surged to her feet, eyes wide, one hand clenching in the fine velvet cloth of her pelisse. "I take it you know why I wish to speak with you." She was nearly a decade younger than her husband, in her mid-20s now,
with luminous green eyes and rich brown hair that curled softly around a heart-shaped face. Her nose was small and delicately moulded, her lips full, her bone structure as flawless as one of Fra Filippo Lippi's Madonnas. But her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, and Sebastian had no doubt that she'd been crying. For Damien Pelletan, he wondered, or for some other reason entirely. He watched as a succession of conflicting emotions flitted across her lovely face, a lifetime of carefully inculcated good manners at war with an instinctive urge to snatch up her little brother and run. Good manners won. "Lord Devlin," she said, graciously inclining her head, although the agitation of her breathing was obvious in the rapid rise and fall of her shoulders. "Walk with me a ways, Lady Peter," Sebastian suggested. She threw a quick, uncertain glance toward the two little boys and their attendant nursemaid. "We won't go far. I'm told you knew Damien Pelletan as a child in Paris." "I did, yes." The native French inflections were still a soft purr in her gently modulated voice. "We grew up next door to each other, but that was years ago. How could those days possibly have anything to do with Damien's death?" "I don't know that they do. At the moment, I'm simply attempting to find out anything that might help explain what happened to him." She turned to walk with him along the gravelled path, the flounced hem of her walking dress brushing the clipped rosemary hedge that grew beside it. "What would you like to know?" "When did you last see Dr. Pelletan?" She hesitated a moment too long, and he had the distinct impression she was tempted to deny having seen Pelletan recently at all. Sebastian said, "Your husband told me he saw Dr. Pelletan a week or so ago. I assume you did as well." "Yes. As I said, we were old friends. He contacted me shortly after he arrived in London, and Lord Peter invited him to dinner one evening." "When was this?" "As my husband said, a week or so ago." "And that was the only time you saw him?" "No. He paid us several afternoon visits as well." Sebastian noted her emphasis of the word us, but decided not to press it. "Did he tell you why he was here in London?" She cast him a hooded sideways glance, obviously hesitant to betray her childhood friend's confidences, even after his death. "Do you know?" she asked. "About the delegation, yes." She nodded, a soft breath of relief escaping her parted lips. "I don't want you to think Damien told me about the peace initiatives himself, because he did not. But my father knew Armand Vondreuil in Paris. He has always been Bonaparte's creature. So when I heard Damien was here with Vondreuil—" She shrugged. "It was supposed to be a secret, but the truth is often not difficult to guess." "Why was Pelletan included in the delegation?" "Vondreuil has a delicate heart. He worries obsessively about his health, fretting over each and every lump and pain, and is in constant need of reassurance. They thought it best that he travel with his own physician. And then, of course, there is Vondreuil's daughter. Madeleine, isn't it?" "Yes." "Do you know about her?" Sebastian shook his head. "She was married to a young cavalry captain, François Quesnel. He was killed last December, in Spain, leaving her with child." "Ah," said Sebastian. They turned to walk back toward the lodge, their gazes on the two boys, who had lost interest in the ball, and now appeared to be vying to see who could hop the farthest on one foot, their shouts and laughter echoing across the park. Unlike his sister, Noël Durand was surprisingly fair-headed, but he had his sister's heart-shaped face and large green eyes. Sebastian said, "How old is your brother?" She gave a soft smile. "He is 8. He lives with you?" He does, yes. Our mother died less than a year after his birth, not long before our father.
I'm sorry. That must have been very difficult for you, to be left alone in a strange country.
It was difficult, yes. But Lord Peter and I were married by then.
She'd been married many years, yet had conceived no children of her own.
And Sebastian found himself thinking of another childless Frenchwoman, likewise living in exile in England.
He said, I understand Damien Pelleton's father is also a physician.
He is, yes.
I'm told he was involved in some way with the French royal family when they were in the Temple prison. Do you know anything about that?
He watched in fascination as the colour drained from her cheeks, her voice ragged as she said,
You don't know? Know what?
Damien's father, Philippe Jean Pelleton, was asked by the National Convention to treat the young Dauphin.
The son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette?
Yes. Dauphin de France was a title traditionally given to the heir apparent to the French throne. Few people today could recall the actual name of Marie-Thérèse's tragic little brother. Most remembered him simply as the Lost Dauphin. He was called lost not so much because of his early death, as because considerable mystery surrounded his ultimate fate. Thrown into prison in 1792 with his parents, his Aunt Elizabeth, and his sister Marie-Thérèse, he was said to have died alone in a cold, dark cell. But within days of the announcement of his death, rumours were already flying, fantastic tales of substitutions and impostors and miraculous escapes. He was just 10 years old at the time, said Lady Peter, nodding to her brother, who was now examining the gravel of the walkway with the intensity of a lapidary studying a new array of specimens.
Not much older than Noel is now. When was this?
Sometime in 1795. Late May or perhaps early June. I don't recall precisely.
And?
The boy was very ill. By that time he had been in prison for more than 2 years, and he'd been treated abominably. She shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. Half-starved, beaten, left to lie in his own filth in a dark cell. Damien's father did what he could, but it was too late. Just a few days later, the prince died.
Did the elder Dr. Pelleton see Marie-Thérèse at that time as well?
I don't know. But I do know that after the Dauphin's death, Philippe Jean Pelleton was brought back to the Temple and asked to perform an autopsy on the boy's body.
And did he?
Yes. Sebastian stared off across the park, a gust of wind sending dry leaves scuttling down the path before them. The skin of his face felt suddenly cold and uncomfortably tight. But surely— She broke off, then tried again. Surely you don't think that events from so long ago could have something to do with Damien's death?
Probably not, he said, to reassure her more than anything else. When you saw Damien Pelleton last week, how did he seem?
What do you mean?
I have the impression that relations between the various members of the delegation are not exactly what you might call harmonious.
A faint gleam of amusement lit up her soft eyes. No, but then it's not surprising, is it? They were all chosen to spy on each other.
Oh?
Armand Vondreuil might be Bonaparte's tool, but that does not mean the Emperor trusts him. Napoleon trusts no one, especially now. You know of the conspiracy to overthrow him last December? Sebastian nodded. The colonel who is with them, Fouché, was the Emperor's selection, not Vondreuil.
And the clerk?
Camille Bonduron is not nearly as meek-mannered or self-effacing as he would appear. I remember Damien saying once that if Bonduron had been born 200 years earlier, in Spain, he'd have enjoyed a brilliant career as a torturer for the Inquisition. And Damien Pelletan himself, why was he selected? Damien is the only one who was Armand Vaudreuil's personal choice. He was here as a physician. He had no role in the negotiations. Yet he agreed to come. Do you know why? Lord Peter asked him that. Damien only smiled and said it's not often a man is offered the opportunity to be a part of history. A coal wagon rolled down the street, heavily laden and pulled by a team of shires leaning into their collars, their breath misting white in the cold air. Sebastian said, "Did Damien ever serve in the French army as a doctor?" She shook her head. "No. He suffered from an illness in his youth that left his limbs weakened. Perhaps that is why he agreed to accompany Vaudreuil. I think it bothered him that he remained in Paris while others fought and died." He was a supporter of the Emperor. Her chin came up in an unexpected gesture of pride. He was a supporter of France. And did he approve of the delegation's objective? You mean peace? After 20 years of war, who amongst us does not long for peace? Even a peace that leaves Napoleon Bonaparte on the throne of France? Damien was no royalist, if that is what you are suggesting. Yet he agreed to consult with Marie-Thérèse. A shadow of worry passed over her features. You know about that? Sebastian said, "The princess has been childless for years. What made her think Damien Pelletan could help her?" One of Damien's passions was the study of ancient herbs, both those that have fallen out of favor here in Europe and those with long traditions among the natives of the Americas and India. He published a number of articles on the subject. Somehow, I find it difficult to picture Marie-Thérèse perusing complicated medical studies. So how did she come to hear of him? I believe it was her uncle who recommended Damien to her. Sebastian watched the boy, Noël, shove his playmate, the boy's angry voices mingling with the shrieks of the maid. Which uncle? Louis Stanislas, the Comte de Provence, the soi-disant Louis XVIII, however you care to style him. He saw Damien himself, you know, just a few days before the princess. No, I didn't know. Somehow, Louis Stanislas had neglected to mention that little fact. The boys were locked together now, rolling over and over in the winter-brown grass beneath the spreading elm. Did Damien Pelletan seem at all— Sebastian paused, searching for the right word. Troubled by his meetings with the Bourbons. She turned to face him. He did, yes. He tried to laugh it off, but I was surprised he even mentioned them to me. I thought perhaps it was because of his father's brief and rather tragic interaction with the family. That the Bourbons consulted him? Or that he was troubled by his meeting with them? I meant that his father's history with the family was the reason the meeting troubled him, of course. She looked puzzled. Why would the Bourbons have decided to consult with Damien because of something his father did 20 years ago? If her imagination wasn't that active, Sebastian wasn't about to enlighten her. He said, "Can you think of anyone who might have wanted to harm him?" Damien? Good heavens, no. He was a good, gentle, caring man who devoted his life to helping others. He'd only been in London a few weeks. Why would anyone want to kill him? How did he get along with Armand Vaudreuil? Well enough, I suppose. After all, Vaudreuil chose him to come here, did he not? Damien had a knack for humouring the man, calming his fears rather than fanning them, the way so many physicians are wont to do in order to make themselves more necessary to their patients. And the others, Fouché and Bondurant, did he have trouble with them? She frowned, as if considering the question. I would say he was wary of both Colonel Fouché and the clerk Bondurant, but I do not know if he ever quarrelled with them. What about someone he might have met in England? She shook her head. He didn't meet many people here in London. That was one of the main reasons the delegation hired that hotel in York Street, was it not? To avoid having to interact with many Englishmen. She paused, her lips parted as if with a sudden thought. "What?" asked Sebastian, watching her. "Last week, I think it was early Thursday morning, Noel and I were walking in Hyde Park. We saw Damien and another man there, near the armory. It was obvious their words were heated, so I stopped Noel when he would have run up to them." "Did Damien see you?" "He did, yes. Noel called out bonjour before I could hush him, so Damien glanced over at us. But I knew from the expression on his face that he wanted us to stay away." "What sort of expression? Annoyance?" "Not annoyance. More like an odd mixture of anger and fear." "Do you know who the man was?" "I don't number him amongst my acquaintances, but I doubt there is anyone in the West End of London who would fail to recognize him. It was Kilmartin, Angus Kilmartin." Sebastian had a sudden clear recollection of having seen the small, bow-legged Scotsman descending the stairs from Jarvis's apartments. "Do you have any idea why Damien would have been meeting him?" "No, none at all." She looked beyond him, to where the nursemaid was now trying to separate the two squabbling boys. "Truly, monsieur, I must go." He touched his hand to his hat and bowed his head. "Thank you for your assistance, Lady Peter. If you think of anything else that might be useful, you will let me know." "Yes, of course." She turned away, the wind gusting hard enough to snatch at the rim of her bonnet. She put up a hand to steady it, and the movement pulled at the sleeve of her pelisse, baring her forearm between the braided cuff and her kid gloves. Against her pale flesh, a row of 4 livid bruises showed quite clearly. Bruises in the exact pattern left by an angry man closing his big, strong hand around a woman's fragile wrist.